Welcome everybody to the second day of our conference, the Cape Breton Highlanders and the Shaping of Canada Conference on Military and Social History. Yes, we are a few moments late and my heart is beating a little faster due to the technological worries, but it sounds now that we've got everything sorted away. So I'm very pleased to announce our first session today, which looks at histories of service, lived experiences of the Canadian military. And our first speaker on this session is going to be Dr. Scott Sheffield, who is an associate professor in the history department at the University of the Fraser Valley. He has authored 3 books and dozens of articles on Indigenous experiences of warfare in Canada. His research expertise encompasses Canadian history, settler-Indigenous relations, and military history more broadly. Sheffield's work will be a major contribution to this conference as he incorporates Indigenous experiences within the study of Canada's military as well as overseas conflicts. Specifically, he's going to be bringing in some cases as well of Mi'kmaq experience in his discussion today. So if we could welcome Scott Sheffield.
Good morning. Just let me see if I can find. I hope I'm not going to screw up anything.
I don't think so. Just minimize. Yeah, just minimize.
Okay.
Here, I can.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't do Apple.
No problem at all. Oops.
That makes me feel better now. Can you? Which one? Good war. Brilliant. Cheers. How's that? All right, sorry, I need these two. I blame thousands of hours of reading microfilm. All right, I wanted to begin today by acknowledging that I'm honored to be a guest here, the ancestral, unceded and beautiful territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I also wanted to acknowledge that I had a very early encounter with a Cape Breton Highlander in my educational career. The very first course I took on Canadian military history was with Reginald Roy at UVic. And he served 6 years through the Second World War, much of it with the Cape Breton Highlanders. That was a big part of what helped launch me into a career as a military historian. So today, I'm going to start the story, 8th of May, 1945. Nazi Germany officially capitulated to the Allied powers, and the much anticipated VE Day, was an occasion for celebration across all of the victorious combatant nations. And similar scenes erupted here across Canada as did elsewhere, marked by ticker tape and bunting, dancing, bands, kissing, and spontaneous acts of joy and relief. And for those nations still heavily involved in the war in the Pacific, VJ Day in August sparked similar scenes, though perhaps less so here in Canada, where for us the war, in capitals, was of course the war in Europe. And these critical dates in 1945 finally brought peace and opened up, after years of anxiety, discipline, and sacrifice, a new era for these societies. Both service personnel and civilians face the future with hopeful anticipation. For the victorious, the Second World War has increasingly come to be represented as the good war of the 20th century. It was untainted by the soulless and seemingly pointless attritional warfare of the Great War, or the moral murkiness that sometimes enshrouded later conflicts like Vietnam. The Second World War, by contrast, appeared uncontestably righteous and ably fought. Who could argue that defeating Hitler and the other totalitarian Axis states was anything but necessary and good? Much less discussed, the aftermath of the Second World War for those individuals and communities who lived through its sacrifices and challenges was just important to fostering the memory of the good war as anything that happened during the war itself. After the First World War, the vindictive peace treaties, the economic hardship of the post-war years, and the global influenza pandemic, which killed millions, all left a sour taste in the mouths who'd fought the war to end all wars. We'd won the war, but somehow we managed to lose the peace, it felt. And so Allied governments the second time round worked very hard to try and avoid a repeat of that experience. This time here in Canada and in other Western Allied nations, the transition to peace was much smoother, and without the sharp recession that had marred 1918, 1919, 1920. This time around, generous veterans' benefits and a growing social welfare system ensured that the million-plus veterans here in Canada successfully transitioned back into the civilian economy. In part due to this, due to these programs, Canada entered into a decades-long period of almost uninterrupted prosperity that lasted through into the 1970s. And it is this post-war experience, this positive post-war aftermath, that is so important to our present-day sentimental view of the Second World War as the good war. For Indigenous peoples, however, their experiences of the war and of the post-war, both for those in the military and those here on the home front, those don't fit the familiar cadence and comforting patterns of the good war experience that Canadians at large went through. For both Indigenous service personnel and civilians, the transition from war to peace was complex and problematic, though in distinct ways that diverged from non-Indigenous patterns. Indigenous peoples may have helped to win the war, but in many ways they also lost the peace after 1945. At home, the war years have been economically the best of times for Indigenous people. Traditional employment in resource industries boomed. Demands to maximize agricultural production meant that on-reserve farming was massively amplified. And a booming wartime industry, combined with, of course, hundreds of thousands of Canadians enlisting in the services, created a voracious demand for labor, where even Indigenous people could find work readily with good incomes. And particularly after the Depression years, where they were the first to be fired and the last to be rehired, the war offered a time of unprecedented prosperity for Indigenous communities, arguably the most prosperous they have ever been after colonization, particularly with young Indigenous men also in uniform and sending home assigned pay and dependence allowance. And so the prospect of the return to peace at the end of the war was faced with something more ambivalent in Indigenous communities. Yes, they shared the joy, the relief, and the eagerness to see the return of loved ones from overseas that other Canadians did. But the end of wartime conditions and the return of peace presented prospects ranging from ambivalent at best to downright bleak in terms of their economic prospects going forward. Like women in the workforce, First Nations workers also faced pressures to make way for returning veterans. Now, the overall trend was loss of jobs, and in some places, wartime employment improvements were not entirely reversed. So you do see some cases, for instance, where the foundations of a particular region's employment opportunities for Indigenous people would be altered in ways that lingered after the war. That happened along the BC coast after the internment of the Japanese population. Japanese men and women had filled an important component to the Pacific salmon fishery, and their places in the cannery were taken by Indigenous women and in the fishing fleet by Indigenous men, by and large, up and down the West Coast. And those positions remained after the war for decades. Far more widespread acceptance had been achieved through wartime contributions. Far from a widespread acceptance achieved through wartime contributions, the war's end mostly marked the end of Indigenous people's relative prosperity and a return to the margins of Canada's economy. Now, the veterans were relieved at surviving the war and leaving its terrors behind. And that, combined with the prospect, of course, of reuniting with family and picking up the threads of a normal life, whatever that was going to look like, made service personnel of Indigenous ancestry just as desperate to get home as were all the others. After months or even years overseas, it is difficult to imagine, I think, the immense and complex feelings that Indigenous service personnel experienced as they anticipated their homecoming. And for many, the warmth of welcome, the kinship of family, the familiarity of home was deeply comforting. One Cree veteran recalled, "I didn't believe that I was home until I got to see my folks. I said to myself, I'm on home ground now. I'm safe." Expectations for homecoming for communities, as for veterans, were ambiguous and complicated, much more so than the popular mythology would suggest. Not all received the return of conquering warriors. Amongst Coast Salish peoples in the Pacific Coast, for instance, veterans recalled that the tragic part is our people looked down on us. They said, "Why did you have to go and join? It wasn't your fight." After we came back from overseas, many of us fell back into the little cracks and holes in our villages, into obscurity. And that hurt a lot of the old veterans. They never did come forward. They never did attend big gatherings. The people of authority amongst our people didn't want them to be recognized that way. And that's what hurt us as veterans, myself as a veteran. Others were welcomed home much more warmly. But the cultural and contextual conditions in each community and each individual veteran's experience shaped a kaleidoscope of experiences that is difficult to consolidate. I think another important factor to recognize as well for returning Indigenous veterans is that they were buoyed up by the tremendous level of acceptance and respect that they had experienced in the services. In the armed forces, they were just one of the guys. For the first time, and often for the last time in their life, they were expected for their capabilities and their character, and who they were or their background didn't matter. And many of them expected that to continue on into civilian life. Perhaps such high aspirations could not help but fall short. To returning veterans, it was immediately clear, however, that the wartime spirit of solidarity and egalitarianism they'd experienced in the forces quickly dissipated upon their return. Many of them had excelled in the armed forces, learned skilled trades, developed linguistic aptitude in English or French, and gained experience and confidence working alongside settler people. And they were optimistic about their opportunities going forward. But this too was often going to be disappointed. As one First Nations veteran recalled, "As long as you're on the reserve, the nearest town won't have anything to do with you. They just regard you as nothing." And that's how we were treated. We were just another Indian. When we were discharged, they told us that we would get first choice of any job at all. That was impossible. I mean, you go out, and I've been rejected so many times. Also challenging for a lot of returned Indigenous servicemen and women after their military service was struggling to return to the level of subservience that was required and expected of them by Indian agents and other Indian Affairs officials. They expected a certain level of obsequious kowtowing. One veteran, however, recalled, especially at that age when I came back, I was bitter against the Indian agent, the Indian Act, the government, and a lot of veterans, frankly, weren't prepared to put up with that bullshit anymore. They just weren't. And this was really troubling because they were often dependent, as you'll see in a bit, on that Indian agent for successful access to their veterans' benefits. We also see an overall pattern of mobility and restlessness for many Indigenous veterans, and I think for many veterans overall. Cree veteran Isaiah Halkett summarized that maybe they just needed to find something they couldn't find at home. And so many moved from reserve communities into urban centers, becoming part of a wave of post-war urbanization for Indigenous people. While they'd been overseas, there'd been a lot of talk about extensive veterans benefits that were going to be available for them, about an exciting new order that Canadians hoped to build in the wake of the conflict. And that only amplified then those heightened expectations. Central to the Indigenous veterans' transition to civilian life was the support available to returning servicemen and women from a thankful country and government. Veterans Charter was a blend of financial rewards, transitional funds, training provisions, employment support and or advantages, loans for land or business development, disability pensions, and a variety of other miscellaneous measures. And the relative success of the reestablishment measures for the vast majority of returned service personnel really contributed massively to our perception of that conflict as the good war. Most Canadian veterans came home and successfully transitioned into a prosperity and a middle class or better existence in the years after the Second World War. That's our narrative. Now, while theoretically accessible equally to all veterans, delivering equal access to veterans programs in practice proved much more difficult in reality, especially when the Indian Act and Indian Affairs became entwined in the delivery of those benefits. For instance, the Indian Act prevented status Indians living on a reserve from accessing loans because banks were forbidden to foreclose or seize property from a reserve. Reserve lands were held in trust by the Crown for the benefit of a particular band. But the Veterans Land Act itself required a veteran to have clear title to a piece of land for a combination loan and grant totaling $6,000. And if you paid that off on schedule, the last $2,320 would be given as a grant, and you wouldn't have to pay that off. Obviously, that's not going to work on a reserve. So instead, the government recognized this, and Section 35A was inserted into the legislation, making the $2,320 grant portion available to First Nations vets who settled on reserve lands. This was nowhere near enough to establish a viable farm. Even the $6,000, one of the main architects of the Veterans Charter claimed was about a third of what was actually needed to make an economically viable farm. And that's one of the reasons why in the years that followed, additional loan programs would be established for Veterans Land Act settlers and veterans, none of which would have been available to Indigenous on-reserve veterans. Arguably more problematic, however, was the separate administrative system developed to manage First Nations veterans' reestablishment. Indigenous veterans fell into a sort of hazy jurisdictional space between Indigenous and veterans administrations. I found one circular letter from the Indian Affairs Branch in Ottawa to its field staff. And it said, the Indian Affairs Branch is not responsible for veteran legislation or administration, excepting administration of grants made under Section 35A of the Veterans Land Act. The branch, however, has everything to do with Indians, which gives you a bit of a sense of the haziness we're talking about. The responsibility typically for the veteran was his own, to look after his own civil reestablishment. The onus was on him to go to a Veterans Affairs counselor to seek support, advice, and to figure out and apply for the appropriate programs, whether they were university, vocational, agricultural. However, that wasn't the case for First Nations. For them, that onus was transferred to the Indian agent. During one veteran's demobilization, Wilfred Westeste, he was listening to a talk by an NCO who was advising men on where to go where they could learn about the various options available to them. And he recalls the advisor saying, oh, by the way, he said, you Indian boys here, he says, you don't go to any of these. He said, you go back to the reserve, the Indian agent will look after you. As a result, First Nations veterans were almost entirely dependent for their successful civil reestablishment on an overworked civil servant of uneven capabilities, who was probably a patronage appointment, dating back to the pre-war era, who was generally ill-informed about the diversity of programs available to veterans, and sometimes only inclined to tell the veteran what he thought that veteran was actually capable of, rather than all the options available to him. So he might not have told him that he could have completed his high school, or if he actually had completed high school, that the option of either vocational school or university was there. Virtually no Indigenous veterans opted for the educational options. Also damaging was the intrusion of Indian Affairs policies and its assimilationist agenda, which at times undermined the value of veterans' benefits or warped them into a coercive tool to impose leverage on Indigenous veterans. So for example, if you look at all status Indian veterans, roughly 70% of them got a Section 35A grant under the Veterans Land Act, usually at the encouragement or under pressure from their Indian agent. Now that's very unusual. If you look across the board, maybe 15% of all veterans, memory serves, actually opted for Veterans Land Act options. So this is totally different sort of trajectory for Indigenous veterans. Now part of the reason that the Indian Affairs agents were advised to do this was that this offered the option to the largest pot of money for the veteran. So there was some good intention in doing so. But it was also almost universally used on reserves to build a house, or at least the majority of a house. It wasn't enough to finish a house. It would get you to basically bare stud walls in the inside. Now, getting a house might improve quality of life in the short term, but that wasn't the purpose of the Veterans Land Act. The Veterans Land Act was one of the 3 major reestablishment programs that was instead intended to establish a veteran in a career that could help him to sustain himself and his family going forward. It wasn't necessarily just a housing program. Essentially what the Indian Affairs branch was doing was using Section 35A grants to subsidize their inadequate on-reserve housing budget at the expense of the veterans. And here in Nova Scotia, there was an additional and problematic decision. Mi'kmaq veterans faced an added challenge because here, Indian Affairs utilized the VLA grants as a stick and a carrot, designed to coerce servicemen and women to abide by Indian Affairs policies to try to concentrate all Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia onto 2 reserves because it would make administration easier for Indian Affairs at Eskasoni and Shubenacadie. And so in Nova Scotia, veterans were only permitted to get a Section 35A grant if they agreed to have that house built on one of those 2 reserves and moved to them. And quite a few did, but subsequently grew disenchanted because they had left their family, their home, and what they knew behind. And so many of them then later returned to their own communities, leaving behind them the only tangible benefit of their Veterans Charter. The overall result then for many First Nations veterans is that the Veterans Charter for them, unlike for the bulk of Canadian veterans, did not translate into a prosperous post-war period. Overall, then, the narrative of hopeful anticipation about the end of the war and the broader warm, fuzzy aura that enshrouds the Second World War, evident in so much of our literature, our popular memory, I think needs to be tempered somewhat with the more ambivalent experiences of Indigenous peoples. First Nations on the home front had looked forward to the end of the war with something closer to dread. For them, the war had been the best of times. But peace promised only a return to the margins and to poverty. First Nations service personnel, by contrast, shared all of the urgency and excitement about returning home with the added optimism of having finally been accepted as an equal after 6 long years of war. But their enthusiasm was also going to be shattered on their homecoming. It's not that the war had not made a difference or that their veteran status didn't matter. It did, and so there was some of that magic that lingered to the veteran status for Indigenous veterans. But all too often they would find after they returned home that that status was trumped by Indian status, that they moved from being an Indian soldier to an Indian veteran to just an Indian. And the mechanics of administering the benefits demonstrated, I think, the continuing limits of acceptance in Canadian society and the circumscribed inclusion of Indigenous peoples in its national social citizenship. Thus, while the Second World War and the resulting Veterans Charter benefits had the possibility, at least, to provoke change in the socio-economic position of Indigenous veterans and their families, the overall impact was really muted. First Nations may have had some of that good war, but they most definitely lost the peace that followed. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Scott. Okay, Hyacinth, could you try turning on your microphone and your video? Okay, there we go. One moment. I don't know. Was it when the PowerPoint went off? Give us a second, Hyacinth, sorry.
Okay.
Here, do I need to turn off the PowerPoint that was just on?
Possibly.
Whoop. Okay, now I can't see anything. Oh, here we go. Okay. There, now we're good. Okay. Always the trouble with, these hybrid conferences, right? Okay, again, thank you to Scott for that interesting presentation. Next, we have Dr. Hyacinth Simpson, who is an associate professor in the Department of English at Ryerson University, where she specializes in Caribbean diaspora, and Black Canadian literature and cultures. Her writings on Caribbean and Black Canadian fiction, poetry, film, and theatrical works have been published in a variety of scholarly and popular outlets. Professor Simpson has spent a decade as the editor-in-chief of a scholarly journal devoted to works by and about Caribbean women in the region and its diasporas. A few years ago, she discovered a passion for historical research and is now happily engaged in uncovering and sharing stories about the contributions of Black Caribbean and Black Canadian servicemen during the Great War. So please welcome Hyacinth Simpson. There.
Thank you.
And if you could share your screen if you'd like.
Yes. Here we go.
Yep, we can see that. Okay, wonderful. We lost it. There we go. We can see that again. All right, whenever you're ready.
It keeps going away. Anyway, I'll just keep it up as it and don't open it. That's it. Okay. All right, good. So thank you for your invitation, Professor Mclennan, to present at the Cape Breton Highlanders and the Sharkey Canada Conference. Friends, and thank you too for the audience that is gathered on Saturday morning so early to listen to my presentation and those of my fellow panelists. I was online for this yesterday on the YouTube channel watching those sessions, and I really enjoyed them. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the programming for today. The title of my presentation, as you can see, is In Living Color: Black Servicemen in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, 1914 to 1980. Most, if not all of us in the room and in the online audience will have heard of the promise the federal government made in March of this year through the Minister of National Defense to make a formal apology for the treatment that the black servicemen in the No. 2 Construction Battalion, a segregated unit in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, received while serving during the First World War. Information about the intent to apologize circulated quickly over the airwaves and online, and all indications are that it was hailed as good news in various quarters. Exactly how the formal apology will be worded and what commemorative activities it will frame and result from it remains to be seen. It is clear, however, that the promised apology has not only increased public awareness of the battalion's existence, but that in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, it signals that Canadians are ready to properly acknowledge World War I service of Black Canadian men and give them a place among the nation's war heroes. Of course, this promised apology is not the first public act of acknowledgement of the No. 2 Construction Battalion's existence. In January of 2016, the No. 2 Construction Battalion's SAM, this one here, was issued in Canada, Post's Black History Month series, with almost 1.5 million units going into circulation. As well, since the early 1990s, men of the battalion have been celebrated annually by their descendants, by black communities, and by Canadian forces at Chignecto, Nova Scotia, where a polished stone monument and plaque were unveiled in 1993. And I think many of you know that Market Wharf in Chignecto was designated a National Historic Site in 1993 to commemorate its role as headquarters for the battalion. Indeed, in Canadian military history circles, the No. 2 is one of the most cited units. But heightened public interest in the No. 2 since the announcement of the intent to apologize has put two very important concerns into sharp relief. First, that the attention given to the men of the No. 2 often eclipses, even erases, the contributions made by other black men in non-segregated units in the CEF. Increasingly, it is becoming less a case of the No. 2 simply functioning metonymically for black service in the CEF, and more that the constant citing and singling out of this unit is resulting in the No. 2 being taken up as the example of black First World War service. When the No. 2 embarked at Halifax in March of 1917, the number of black NCOs and rank and file of the Dublin Road was just over 600, but reliable estimates put the number of black men served overseas and at home in the CEF between 1,200 and 1,500. So the No. 2 was just about half of the estimated number of men served. So the history of the No. 2, while very, very important, cannot, should not be taken as fully representative of black World War I military experience. For example, while it is true that the widespread rejection faced by black individuals was the main catalyst leading to the creation of the No. 2, the fact remains that hundreds of other black men had service experiences unique to the cultures of the various non-segregated units with which they served. What those experiences were and what they could reveal about the operations of the CEF during a conflict that was often described as a white man's war is yet to be investigated, and it's an important investigation to undertake. Without undermining or de-emphasizing the importance of the anti-black racism that has been ingrained in the No. 2 Construction Battalion's history, it is also true to say that Black Canadian First World War history is not only a story of segregation, neither is it only a story of black men who were made to wield axes and shovels instead of rifles and other weaponry in the cold and damp of the forest of Le Jules France. It is, among other things, also the story of men who served the Canadian Forces Corps in the UK, including the interactions they had with locals there and how those relationships and the work they did shaped their war experience. It is also the story of those who stayed at home to guard critical facilities 13 black volunteers and conscripts who served in France and Belgium outside the number 2 construction battalion or the forestry companies. Men with distinguished records who boasted among their military achievements a military cross, a distinguished conduct medal, and 7 military medals. I should say here that I am indebted to the research of Major Matthias Jukes for this bit of information on this specific group of volunteers and conscripts. So that is the first concern. The second, then, is about an arguably singular focus on the number 2, at least in the public sphere, because military historians of various stripes are at work as I speak, recovering and documenting the war service of black men beyond the number 2. The second, with an arguably singular focus on the number 2 in the public sphere, there has been a real problem. I put it as a second concern, but maybe it should have been the first because it's a real concern. With the arguably singular focus on the number 2 in the public sphere, there has been a real problem with the circulation of misinformation online and elsewhere about the history of the battalion. Such misinformation is rooted in unsubstantiated claims of heroic exploits on the part of some of the men of the number 2 companies in France. Stories are told, for example, about the men engaging in armed conflict, and there are anecdotes about their exemplary behaviors and actions, which seem to be aimed at proving that they were worthy of the uniform they wore, despite the demeaning labor they were made to do, and especially despite, the rejection they faced from military authorities while enlisting. And most of these stories are unverified. They cannot be substantiated from existing records. On the one hand, it could be argued that such misinformation has come about because enthusiastic parties are attributing bits from the histories of other black CEF men to number 2 company men in France. And this is happening precisely because the number 2, for many, stands in for black First World War service. Bits of second-hand, undigested information from emerging research on the other stories of black service in the CEF that I mentioned earlier get grafted onto the men of the number 2 and reinforced through the simultaneous circulation of a few select and now very familiar images of the number 2 men. And these are just 2 of the ones that get circulated ad nauseum, and they're associated with all these stories of heroic exploits, and we're not sure if they were, done by the men in the number 2 or by other men, and the misinformation just continues to circulate. And we are all very aware of the power of the internet in facilitating the widespread dissemination of incorrect information. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, a strong argument can be made for understanding the misinformation about the war exploits of the number 2, not in, misdirected enthusiasm, but we could argue that the misinformation is taking root because there's a tendency to use black exceptionalism as a means of countering the invisibility that black communities, often written out of histories, know only too well. Black exceptionalism is a corrosive view of blackness because it suggests, whether those who embrace this way of thinking realize or not, that black people measure up and prove themselves worthy of inclusion only when they can demonstrate qualities that at the very least meet, or better still surpass, certain ideals. Translated into the context of Canadian military history and how that history is consumed and regenerated in public spaces, this means the inclusion of the number 2 story requires, in the minds of some, dressing up so that its members can be deemed properly heroic. It is not enough for them to have served. Distinguished service is required. They need to have been exceptional, extraordinary, exemplary. And falsely ascribed stories of valor, as I pointed out earlier, become even more noteworthy in the face of the constraints the number 2 men struggled with because of their race. Black exceptionalism, make no mistake, plagues black communities from within and it hems Black communities in from the outside. When as members of Black communities and people who are interested in Black military histories, when we insist that our servicemen deserve sufficient space in the annals because they prove themselves as good as, or even better than those who have never had to fight, be seen, or recognized, then we are validating the notion that we are never enough unless we meet certain criteria. And when non-Black reporters and writers and military enthusiasts, and military history enthusiasts, repeat unverified claims about Black exceptionalism of the number 2 men, their praises do little to counter anti-Black racism and instead reinforce restricting ideas about Blackness. One troubling outcome is that even those validated stories about Black men who accomplished extraordinary feats while serving get co-opted into a larger, reductive narrative of Black exceptionalism that ignores the value of the ordinary, everyday, and even imperfect aspects of Blackness. And here is somebody who is probably well known to some of you. This is a photo of Jeremiah Jones of the 106th Battalion, who was posthumously awarded a Canadian Forces Medallion for distinguished service. And this is a photo of John Bright of the 36th Regiment and the 1st Battalion, who was a military medal recipient. So, even these stories, validated stories about Black men who accomplished extraordinary feats, get co-opted into a larger and reductive narrative of Black exceptionalism that ignores the value of the ordinary, everyday, and imperfect aspects of Blackness. These stories of extraordinary achievements of individual Black men are being used to burnish the credentials of the number 2 men in problematic ways. So where do we go from here? One solution, one approach that I am championing is a deliberate reorientation of our focus towards recognizing and valuing Black service in the CEF, not in terms of exceptionalism, but in terms of simply honoring the lives of the men themselves, those in the number 2, as well as those in non-segregated units. And they stand whether those lives are unremarkable, problematic, or inspiring. The more we see Black servicemen in the CEF as individuals, the more we value them as men, as fathers, sons, husbands, laborers, students, professionals, unemployed, as men from large urban centers and country boys from small rural hamlets. The more we value them as individuals and men, the closer we get to properly acknowledging their Canadianness. Exceptionalism is not needed. The CEF comprised men of varying backgrounds and from varying walks of life. Men who had already made Canada home and those who chose it after the war. They hail from the West Indies, England, all Black Canadian communities, the United States, Australia, etc. And their stories of migration, settlement, relocation, service, and sacrifice made for a uniquely Canadian history of a nation at war. I'm not saying we don't need to celebrate the achievements of individual men, but the larger story is about these men, who they were, where they came from, what their lives were like, because they constitute the fabric of the CEF and also Black Canadian military history of the First World War. I'd like to close with a very quick look at 3 of the men in the 106th Battalion, because I would like us to focus on, and going forward, that more focus is given to, and more attention is given to Black men outside the CEF, simultaneously as more work is being done on the men in the number 2. The 3 men that I want to close with are among the 16 Black enlistees that Calvin Ruck, this is a snapshot of the from Calvin Ruck's book, that Calvin Ruck identified in that non-segregated battalion. All 3 men were born in the West Indies. 2 of them, Private Nathaniel Bush and Lieutenant Hugh Allen Gaskin, had made Cape Breton, Sydney Cape Breton, their home prior to the outbreak of the war. The 3rd, Private William Anstey or Anster, had settled in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Their life stories captured in part in the details of their attestation papers and extended in census documents, city registers, immigration records, etc., provide, among other things, interesting insight into the composition of Black communities in small and large areas in Nova Scotia during the war years. And if we look at other non-segregated battalions and look at the lives of the Black men there, we can glean even more information about the communities, the Black communities across Canada and their relationships with the larger Canadian society. The details of these men's lives and what they reveal about Canada in the war years will have to be taken up at another time. But what I'd like to draw your attention to now is how their photographs, and let me go back here because I want to compare the three men, is how their photographs lined up with military precision and orderliness alongside that of their peers, whose backgrounds and everyday lived experience differed from theirs, made visible what the war really was about. So these are 3 pages that I pulled from the album of the 106 Battalion. And I pulled out the faces of the 3 men. So this is Anster, this is Gaskin. So what I'm arguing is that when we look at these pages and we see how, their photos are included in the nice orderly lineup that we see on each album page, that what this makes visible is what the war really was about. Hundreds and thousands and hundreds of thousands of men, each with his own unique story, who came together to serve one goal over a 4-year period. The visual uniformity of the album pages, achieved through their standard issue clothing, is productively interrupted when we zoom in close on each man, looking more closely at his features and perhaps wondering what the lines and contours of his face can tell us about where he's from and what clues, if any, we can glean about what his life was like before he enlisted. I have time, I think, for one final word, so I'll end where I began by looking forward to the opportunities provided by the promised federal apology to rethink how we recover, interpret, and disseminate information about the histories of Black servicemen in the CEF. And the way we do that should counter anti-Black racism rather than reinforce them. And what I've been arguing is that, this overemphasis on Black exceptionalism is in fact one of the ways in which we reinforce anti-Black racism without realizing it many times when we do it. So thinking forward to, the apology which we're expecting will come sometime around next July, again on the anniversary of the authorization of the number 2 battalion. This is a screenshot of the symposium that I organized earlier this year in March. And the next event will be a webinar, a 90-minute webinar, with panelists gathered from National Advisory Committee that's advising the minister who announced the intent to apologize, hopefully people from the military and a few other parties, to discuss in a public forum with as many people from all walks of life that we can gather to discuss, the progress on the intent to apologize, and also how in moving forward we can begin to write the histories of Black men in the CEF, in and beyond the number 2, in ways that are more liberatory, in ways that are more celebratory of them as human beings, rather than caricatures who exceed the mark, and that's what we stand. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I look forward.
Thank you, Dr. Simpson, for the fascinating lecture. Give me a moment. I'll call up the next PowerPoint, and then we'll move along. All right, well, most of you here know me because I've been speaking to you for the last 2 days. But if I'm a stranger to you, my name is Lachlan Mckinnon, and I'm a professor in the history department here at CBU. So to begin, industrialization in Cape Breton kind of really set the stage for urbanization, the movement of populations into places like Sydney, Glace Bay, Sydney Mines, and of course elsewhere, and the steady development of the former colonial center of Sydney. Now, while coal extraction itself has a long history here, as we heard, yesterday, dating back to 1720, as it was harvested by French settlers for use at Louisbourg, at Cow Bay, the island's steel industry in Sydney was a relatively late bloomer. Construction at the newly envisioned integrated steel mill in downtown Sydney, down at the Open Hearth Park, began in 1899, founded, of course, by Henry Melville Whitney, an American financier, the namesake of Whitney Pier, and whose excellent biography was published in Acadiensis in 1979 by my former colleague, Don McGilvery. It was with the completion of that mill that Whitney and company directors began seeking new sources of labor. And so by 1911, immigrants from continental Europe ballooned to around 32% of all immigrants arriving in Cape Breton, in addition to Newfoundlanders and people from the British Isles, as well as the rest of Canada. Now, these new Central and Eastern European arrivals included Hungarians, Croatians, as well as Polish. Likewise, the development of the coal mines in the towns that I mentioned, Glace Bay, later New Waterford, Sydney Mines, attracted migrants from a number of different Polish regions, at the time under the political control of, in part, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Germany. Archival records from the Beaton Institute provide actually some of the most illuminating sources for examining the lives of these earliest arrivals in Sydney from Eastern Europe and Central Europe. Indeed, records left from the life of one man, Anthony Semeski, reveals the true kind of transnationalism of his immigration experience. His story, in many ways, I think challenges the neat pattern of immigration from one area and the establishment of a new life rooted directly in kind of a new community, Cape Breton in Semeski's case. Rather, what we see is the continued existence of a number of transatlantic, kind of transcontinental relationships, memories, family ties, and obligations that result in a constant kind of push and pull from across the Atlantic during the process of his personal growth as what he called a true Canadian in his letters. In his letters. And indeed, these form the basis of kind of the formation of his own identity as a new Canadian. And all of these things were brought together when Semeski enlisted and served in the First World War. Focusing on the British Atlantic world, historian Kevin Hutchings calls upon scholars of transatlantic migration to resist what he calls that conventional nationalist framework, coming from one place, settling another, and that's the end of the story. Rather, he calls on historians to employ kind of a multi-directional understanding of immigration as a pattern. And I think Semeski, his life might be used as a lens through which this idea is made a little more clear. So Anthony arrived in Cape Breton in 1912 from the Posen region of Poland, at the time under the annexation of Germany. He's listed as standing here approximately 5'6", nearly 5'7", with medium dark complexion. He was a Roman Catholic. Initially, he found work in Glace Bay as an interpreter with the Dominion Coal Company before moving to Ross Block in Sydney, then down by Charlotte Street, to work for the Dominion Iron and Steel Corporation as both an interpreter and a foreman at the mill. Of course, interpreters were in dire need for all of these new arrivals. And in July of 1916, Semeski announced to his friends his intention to join the Canadian military and he indeed hoped that he would see service in Europe. His friends lauded those intentions, holding a celebratory soiree, while Semesky arranged the details of his enlistment in the Nova Scotia Rifles, 106th Battalion Nova Scotia Rifles, with Lieutenant M.J. Dryden. In the letter from Dryden, he's told, "Bring your naturalization papers. We'll be sailing for England in 2 weeks." Much of Semesky's thoughts on the matter are indeed found in the extensive correspondence written home to his friends in Sydney during his wartime service. And on the eve of his departure, he writes, "Dear friends, I'm going to fight in the Battle of Free Nations, and I will prove true to my oath as a Canadian, and to any service that will be required, will gladly sacrifice my own life. Nobody knows it better except he who has felt the weight of German atrocities himself. I do not blame the authorities for being careful in accepting me, but they should accept the offers of a man that really means it and will truly stand by his oath." That's the end of the quote. Now, the German atrocities that he makes reference to are never actually clarified, though it does appear that he's referring back to his earlier life in Poland under the annexation of Germany. Now, in other letters, nearly all of which are written to his close friend, Robert Hubly, Semesky expresses his dwindling excitement about the notion of serving overseas. Letters throughout July are cheery, referencing good health, the attractiveness of various women, and his enjoyment of the ship voyage. The same tone infects his first communications from France, noting that it's better to be covered with mud and, quote, "It's better to be covered with mud now and with glory in the end. Don't you think so too?" The messages start to shift quickly. By March of 1917, Semesky explains, quote, "The situation is getting pretty hot over here," and describes resting in cellars as the constant sound of artillery keep him on edge. In one of the last letters, written on the 18th of April, 1917, just after Semesky survives the Battle of Vimy Ridge, he describes that experience. Quote, "April the 9th was a hot one, believe me. The Canadians did splendid, and they can hardly give them enough praise. As thick as the drops of rain, the shells, bullets started to fly, and shrapnel from all sides. It's a marvel how easy we got off with our casualties. And I will never forget that day in my life, as well as the 8 following days." Now then there's a gap in the correspondence, and the next letter that's received is on May 21st, when Robert Hubly gets a telegraph in Sydney announcing that Anthony Semesky has been missing since the 28th of April, just 10 days after posting that letter that I just read to you. Indeed, Semesky had been captured and taken to the Limburg prisoner camp. He was later transferred to the Friedrichsfeld prisoner of war camp. In July, he posted his first letter describing the conditions, decrying the lack of food, and expressing his sincere hopes that he would return to Sydney. Now, between 2 postcards and a longer letter sent during the fall and winter of 1917 and into 1918, the conditions are clearly deteriorating. He says, quote, "I've lost my self-control, not out of joy or happiness, but something that I don't wish anybody to face. I never before knew what an empty stomach was and what hunger meant." Now, through this correspondence, Semesky's thoughts return consistently to his friends in Cape Breton, including Lily, who's mentioned in several occasions before and after his capture, as well as asking about, workers at the mill and Robert Hubly himself. In September, he writes, quote, "Tell Lily I'm well and my mind is occupied with her, and like to hear from her that she is the same. Also, let me know how she is taken, and when you first received the news that I was taken prisoner." In his final letter, dated in March of 1918, he insists that he's feeling well, and indeed asks Robert to send his regards. He says, "I'm very much," this is his final letter. He says, "I'm very much indebted to you, Bob, for all the care you are taking in my part. I shall never forget it. Remember me to Lily and to all the boys, all of our neighbors and friends. You know who they are, so I needn't mention all their names. Best of luck and wishes to yourself. I remain as ever, your pal, Anthony." 2 months later, on the 2nd of May, 1918, Anthony Semesky died at the Friedrichsfeld prisoner of war camp. His cause of death is listed as weak heart/dropsy. Now, Semesky's story, I think, speaks to that immigrant experience that I mentioned in early 20th century Canada, writ large, and the archives at the Beaton Institute help to paint a portrait, through the material and cultural conditions that he must have experienced after making his decision to relocate first from Poland to Sydney, then from Sydney to serve back in Europe, where he's writing letters back to Sydney. As another historian, Thomas Primack, explains, for many Central European immigrants to Canada and the United States at this time, such a decision offered an opportunity for what he called a radical remaking of the self. This includes the development of a new set of economic relationships, new identities, a new identity as a Canadian in Semesky's case, in conversation with old ones, and new interpersonal relationships between different groups, right? He's in Sydney at a time where the real multicultural nature of Cape Breton is coming into view. Now, it's in understanding these more personal developments in the lives of these types of men that I think Semesky's correspondence becomes particularly useful, because there are several important factors that separate his story from those that have been analyzed in other stories of immigrant letters in general. First, his archived correspondence does not include letters that he sends back to Poland. Or to family and friends in Poland. Rather, they're all showing letters are being directed towards Canadian officials, members of the military, friends in Sydney, and so on. Secondly, the Semesky records, I think, provide insight into the limitations of the archive and what they can show us about, the experience of soldiers at war. And in this sense, particularly, what's invisible through Semesky's writings, which I'll talk about in a moment. Indeed, what's invisible and what's only revealed in the aftermath of his death is especially interesting. Now, throughout the letters, it appears that he's romantically available. He doesn't explicitly say that, but the tone of the letters kind of make that clear. Despite all of this, and indeed, he comments on the women in Sydney and in England. He mentions various women by name, including Lily. And despite all of this, his clear focus is on communicating some of his experiences of the war, keeping up his own spirits, maintaining friendships, and looking for information from Robert. Now, were these the only sources available, one would have the sense that Semesky had very little that was still tying him to Poland. He's not talking about it. He's not writing, asking about any information to his friends in Sydney, at least, and he's not mentioning any of that history. And indeed, through these letters, it appears that Sydney is his home. He considers himself, quote, again from that letter, a true Canadian, and his friends, Robert Hubley and the other friends in Sydney at the mill, are the strongest bonds that he holds. Now, this view is shattered, though, by the introduction of a separate series of letters that were donated to the archive after the initial Semesky correspondence. Now, within the new session of letters, there was another letter. This one sent to Robert Hubley on the 29th of September, 1922, 4 years after Anthony's death. It details the travails of Maria Semesky, who was writing, seeking information on her husband, Antony. Written in Polish and translated by CBU political scientist Tom Urbaniak, the letter describes Anthony's abandonment of Maria and his decision to relocate to Canada in the first place when he arrived from Poland. Due to my financial hardship, she writes, I trust that you will not complicate matters and please facilitate my request by sending me my husband's owed service pay, as well as any of the circumstances that you were aware of surrounding my husband's death. She had been trying to find Anthony to get in touch with him and then receive news that he had passed, and only got in touch with Robert years after. So Maria's letter, I think, provides an opportunity to bypass one of the primary difficulties of analyzing wartime or immigration letters, if we're looking at correspondence as a source, right? This is what historian David Gerber calls, quote, the problem of what letter writers choose not to write. right? In his letters, he's very clearly positioning himself as a new Canadian, strongly attached to that sense of national pride and identity, with the world open in front of him, very clearly leaving things in Poland behind and not mentioning some parts of that story, right? So in this case, Anthony's friends in Sydney had no idea of Maria's existence, and never was there any mention of a family in Poland, and all of the correspondence outside of this last letter presents Anthony as a single sojourner. But why does this matter then? And what does it have to do with, wartime correspondence or immigrant identities? Now, I think that it's important for a broader conversation in that it creates an insightful view into the interaction between memory and correspondence as a historical source and identity formation, particularly among immigrant groups coming into Sydney at this time, and the process that identities are forged through service in the military, in conflict. In Anthony's correspondence, he's consciously establishing himself as a particular archetype of a good Central Canadian immigrant. He's principled and committed to his new country. He's shaped by the experience of oppression by the hands of Germans in Posen. And he's both understanding and forgiving of the suspicion that he initially encounters in the Glace Bay coal mines when he's there. In other letters, he's writing about overcoming prejudices towards, Central European immigrants once he arrives in Cape Breton at the coal mines, and indeed even when he goes to enlist. So historical memory here is very close to the surface, right? We're talking about yesterday different ways of thinking about Canada's military history, the types of sources we use, and so on. Yes, Anthony Sumeski was a man from Poland, but he was also insistently Canadian. But Maria's letter, coming in later, reminds us that conscious forgetting and what's left out plays a role in building these complicated histories as well. And I think that you can think of all kinds of reasons why that would be true, not only in Sumeski's case, but in all kinds of other wartime correspondence. And indeed, as we see, there is an entire undescribed, submerged part of Anthony's life and his identity and his personality that didn't fit with the mold that he had created for himself, and so was consciously omitted from the texts that he chose to produce, right? And so I think that lesson, when we're talking about going by correspondence as a historical source, I think is important to keep in mind and try and move beyond as we try to build these histories of Canadian military service and so on. Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll have maybe 5 minutes for questioning because we're a little over time, but certainly you can have a talk when you're on your coffee break. Maybe I'll walk around with the mic and anybody who wants to ask a question, and I'll turn Dr. Simpson back to the room. Sure, that would be great. Is it on? No, maybe not. Okay. Sorry, Chris, is the second mic working? Sure. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, you were supposed to stay here. Yeah, we'll do that then. Okay, are there any questions? Yes, Brian. Sure, yeah, if you could, just while we get that sorted.
Not an important point, really, probably, but perhaps it is. Talking about his wife that he left behind in Poland, no doubt he promised her when he left that he would be, as soon as he could, he would have the money for her to join him, probably. But that may not have been his intention from the outset, or it may have been, I don't know. But the idea of men, well, maybe not even necessarily if they served in the war, who left their wives to serve in the war, and then just kind of moved on. I've run across that. Sometimes they left their wives even before the war, but during the war, after the war, Stuart Hunt did that, the author of, compiler of the book on Nova Scotia in the war. He left his wife and daughter and went out west and moved to the United States, married, had more children, never divorced, never came back. I can think of a couple of members of my own family, in fact, who did the same thing. They actually broke up, but they never divorced, both remarried. You could do that in those days. With somebody like that, I think maybe he left, discovered a new world, and it obviously appealed to him, and he just turned his back on that. Sorry. Minor point.
No, I think you're exactly right, Brian. It's clearly a choice to commit himself fully to the new experience that he sees when he arrives in Glace Bay, right? And then to go and serve and everything else. I think that plays a big role in this. Any other questions? Is that working now? Yeah, okay.
I'd like to thank Dr. Simpson for that very illuminating presentation she gave on black soldiers in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. It's almost like a voice in the wilderness. We have been at the Army Museum in Halifax putting forward the stories of the some 2,000 other black men who served in the CEF outside of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. And it's often difficult to succeed in putting forth that narrative. And I very much appreciate the effort that you've put into this and your perspective on that, because it's one that's been missing for years, and it oftentimes undermines the role of those other men who served, in many cases, decorated for gallantry so well during the Great War. And I want to thank you again for that. It was a fascinating and very useful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, because and I'm also really happy to hear that your number is over 2,000 beyond the number 2, because the estimate I gave was initially based on the research done by Hans Gale, whose father was in the number 2 and who himself served in World War II. And so as more researchers go through the records that are now digitized and start, identifying these men through their attestation records, then we find that there are so many more men, and that the stories are far more varied than we were led to believe initially. And so it's wonderful to hear what you're doing, and more of us will make more flights, and hopefully we can have, a better sense of the life and the fabric and the texture of blackness and military service in Canada, and how that extends out to the larger Canadian society in a few years to come.
Hyacinth, really enjoyed your talk. It's Scott Sheffield. I was struck by your use of the term exceptionalism in the context in which you were using it. In my work looking at the sort of history of Indigenous peoples' military service, the same pattern was widely prevalent, particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s, before the official apology in 2003 to First Nations veterans. And that was part of that politicization process as well, to focus on the examples of exceptional soldiers doing exceptional things, and often in a way kind of recreating older stereotypes of Indigenous people as somehow warlike or natural warriors, well-intentioned, obviously, but in a way problematic and dehumanizing in its own way of everyday Indigenous soldiers who undoubtedly span the spectrum from excellent soldiers to, decent soldiers to maybe not such good soldiers. And I think it's hard to get, it's been easier to get past that focus on exceptionalism after the apology. So you might be moving towards a time period where that gets easier to explore that more broad human spectrum of experience.
Yes. Oh, I'm I'm so glad to hear of your work on that end as well. And you know, it's this constant fear of you know, being less than, and I talked about the need to make ourselves visible in ways that you know, we haven't been able to, and that drive and that fear around invisibility is what fuels that, you know, that over presentation of the self in ways that don't do communities that have been marginalized any good. And just very quickly, I know that time is of the essence, but a book that I've been reading lately is the one called Black Soldiers in the White Man's War by Gordon Douglas Pollock. And one of the things that's bothering me about this book is that it goes to the other extreme of digging into the history of the number 2 in a way that, you know, sees the men as troublemakers. So it presents itself as a counter to all what he calls the myth-making of the number 2 as, you know, heroic figures. And so he delves into the military records and talk about, you know, the disciplinary measures that were taken against a number of the men in the unit and how that reflects that they were an unruly bunch. And so it's this kind of, you know, point counter point, thrust counter thrust, that I think is fueling, on the one hand, you know, the demythifying, and then on the other hand, the remythifying, so that sometime, somewhere, somehow, hopefully we will fall within the middle, where neither figures, you know, so largely in the scheme of things, and we can begin to see the men as human beings.
All right, wonderful. So thank you, Dr. Simpson, for your answers and for your wonderful presentation. Thanks to Scott. I think we'll call this session for now, and I invite everybody to grab a tea or coffee, and we'll come back in a few minutes for our next session. So a round of applause again for our thanks very much. We're about to get started on our last session of the conference before our final keynote. Tim Cook of the Canadian War Museum will be introducing our presenters, and then I'll come back and work my technical magic and bring them to you from Zoom and in person and everything else. So welcome, Tim Cook.
Wonderful to be here and to introduce such fabulous colleagues. I think we're sorting this out as we move, of course, with the digital and people here, and I think we've decided, Lachlan, that it's better if I introduce all 4 now. So I will do that, and then I think Lachlan will continue to do his wonderful work here. So I'll introduce our first speaker, Anne-Marie Lane Jonas. She's a historian with Eastern Canada team of the Archaeology and History branch of Parks Canada. She began her career in Cape Breton, where she worked at Louisbourg, which we've heard so much about, where she worked for 11 years. In 2010, she contributed a chapter to a history book. This is a tasty one, listen to this. Chocolate, A History of Culture and Heritage. Fantastic. And she's co-authored other works as well. She's an award winner. And she's relocated to Halifax, where she has become involved with numerous exhibit projects for the National Historic Sites in the Maritime provinces. Again, moving on to our second speaker, and then we'll come back to others, is Ken Hines. Ken, so great to see you again. Many years we have been in touch from Halifax, as many of you know. He served over 30 years in the Canadian Army in the artillery, both at home and abroad. Ken is a graduate of the Canadian Army Command and Staff College. He holds a number of degrees, but he is the director of the Army's Museum, the First World War Centennial Exhibition Project, where I was able to see that wonderful exhibition that you did for I think to help so many Canadians understand Vimy and the First World War. He's led other major projects, and he was just telling me he's looking forward to a little bit of a quieter period to engage in other writing projects very soon. Our third speaker, Jane Arnold, is an archivist at the Beaton Institute at the Cape Breton University. And Jane, of course, has been doing wonderful work here at the conference and sharing the incredible archives with all of us who will listen. And historians and archivists, of course, are so deeply entwined and I think rely so heavily upon each other. Jane Arnold participates as a board member with Heritage Cape Breton Connection, the Old Sydney Society, and works with the Council of Nova Scotia Archives. She's done incredible projects, and she'll be speaking about the military records in the Beaton Institute to us. And finally, my friend Wes Cross, speaking to us from Montreal. Wes is a co-founder of the McGill Remembers Project, which aims to raise awareness of military history. He is also a great champion of archives and making archives available. He gives unstintingly of his time to many projects. He's lectured on a range of military history topics. He created the British Regiments in Canada, an NAC-listed resource in tracking pre-1871 deployments in North America. Wes has been featured on the CBC, the CTV, the BBC, the ITV over the years, and he's currently executive counsel for the James McGill Society. So we have 4 wonderful speakers for this session, and I'm going to hand it over to Lachlan to help with the technical matters. Thank you.
All right, Anne-Marie, we're going to lose you on the screen in a minute as I call up your presentation. And then when you want me to switch, just say, next slide or so on.
Okay, I will do. Thanks very much, Lachlan. I guess as you work with that, I don't know if I'm audible to the room, but...
You are audible to the room, yes.
Awesome. I just wanted to express my thanks, Lachlan, for inviting me to be part of this. I had so hoped it would give me a chance to get to Cape Breton, but unfortunately, our agency is not quite ready to sponsor travel on that level yet, so I have to be virtual. But I did want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you from Kespekwik, Southern District of Mi'kma'ki, so I'm not too terribly far away from you all, and I'm really delighted to be part of the conference. And I am just going to give you a whole bunch of maps, because that's what I do.
Chris, do you know which one is Anne-Marie's? You're going to have that. Okay. Anne-Marie, what's the title of your PowerPoint that you sent?
Revealing Chignecto. And the cover slide is green, I do believe. Yes, Revealing Chignecto, National Historic Sites, Landscapes and Memory. But I might have titled it CBU Highlanders Presentation. (2021), and then I just have AML Jonah at the end. We could always go to Plan B and I'll share a screen.
Yeah, maybe try to do that because I'm not seeing it here on the computer.
Okay, just one moment and I'm just gonna, okay. See. There.
All right.
And I'll get that out of the way.
Yep.
How does that look?
It looks beautiful. We can see that wonderfully.
Okay, perfect. And now I will check my skills. I can change the slides. All right. I am all set. I'll take off now. Thanks very much, Lachlan.
No problem at all.
All right. So my presentation today, I will back it up a bit, revealing Chignecto, National Historic Sites, Landscapes and Memory, comes from a shared exhibit project that I have been working with for Northern New Brunswick, the Chignecto National Historic Sites, since 2017. And when we started this project in 2017 to create an exhibit for these sites, we recognized so shortly after the report of the Commission on Truth and Reconciliation came out that our approach to this history would have to be different than past approaches. But at that time, we did not have a model upon which to base our approach. And in many ways, it was a voyage of discovery. It was a new exhibit project and figuring out how to approach it. So for anyone who doesn't know Chignecto, which would mean you've never left the province by land, Chignecto is the narrow neck of land, the isthmus, that connects the mainland with the rest of the continent. It has also been, since time immemorial, the center of the district of Chignecto of Mi'kma'ki. It is a point both of division, the border between colonial claims in the 18th century and later Canadian provinces, and a point of connection, connecting waterways as well as landways to connect throughout the maritime region and beyond. The Parks Canada story of Chignecto has been centered on 5 National Historic Sites. Fort Beausejour, Fort Cumberland, which was built in 1750-51 on a ridge overlooking the isthmus from the northwest of the Mississauga River. Beaubassin, an Acadian village destroyed in 1750, and Fort Lawrence, built in 1750 on the ruins of the village on a ridge to the southeast of the river. And Tongues Island, Ile de la Valliere, basically a lump in the middle of the marsh between these sites, and Fort Gaspereau on the north end of the isthmus, facing the Northumberland Strait. For 100 years, the Government of Canada has commemorated this space as a crucial flashpoint in the period before the 7 Years' War. But much work by the Acadian community in the past 40 years have challenged that view. In this context and the context of truth and reconciliation, we hope to create an exhibit highlighting multiple perspectives and interpretations, sharing a much broader view of why this place was important. We chose to approach this by addressing how we know as well as what we know. By foregrounding what sources of information become history and receive public commemorations, we also highlight how people choose what stories to tell. This exhibit would include landscape and material culture, would approach written document from multiple perspectives, reading against the grain to address gaps and biases of the texts, and hopefully to tell a more complete story. The level of collaboration, partnerships, and new research needed for this work was an enormous logistical challenge for a tiny exhibit. The difference in approach and in outcome is a testament to the will, I believe, and the commitment of the team. Parks Canada's staff, my colleagues in Northern New Brunswick, our external contractors, and team members from Mi'kmaq de Burt Cultural Centre in Nova Scotia and Mi'kmaq de Blagan Incorporated in New Brunswick, as well as many elders and experts who answered requests for advice and offered guidance. Together, we were able to challenge accepted narratives and to see our shared history as a resource and a tool that can support the goal of reconciliation. Our exhibit would address both how the inhabitants lived in the place and valued it, and then how conflict shaped or reshaped it. This map is from the exhibit itself, and I'll explain a little more and would be happy to answer questions about it. To understand the Acadian Mi'kmaq shared space at Chignecto, we first needed to understand how the original inhabitants interacted with the landscape. We were able to conduct an archaeological literature review to support the exhibit, and this review, which was run by our Indigenous partners, MTI in New Brunswick, provided a picture of an Indigenous presence focused on the areas of the rivers and coasts and focused on the use of marine resources, supplemented with local flora and fauna beginning more than 10,000 years ago. There have been significant finds of artifacts near the mouth of the Missaguash and Tantramar rivers, and I can put in this area, and at Bay Verte near Northport on the Northumberland and shore of the isthmus. There are a number of sites that have yielded multi-era objects, including 7 sites that contained objects spanning the periods prior to European arrival and after. The map of sites identified on the isthmus shows the organization of land use around waterways, portage routes, and meeting places. So all the Indigenous sites on this map are marked with red dots and the red place names. When archaeologist Sarah Beamlands analyzed the pattern of the site, she quickly discerned that they mapped well with the arrangement of villages created by the Acadians in the late 17th and early 18th century. Those are marked with the black dots on the map. The exhibit centers maps such as this one and uses overlays to show changes over time based on this evidence, allowing visitors to see the interplay of indigenous traditional knowledge and land use and later colonial settlements and land use. Existing archaeology also bears witness to the mobility associated with Chignecto, connecting the coastal and river routes shown on the map. The river routes and portages are marked with the blue lines on the map. So I have trouble looking from one thing to the other, apologies. Showed the Acadians' use of space in response to the Mi'kmaq, their communities being in proximity, not one replacing the other. Archaeology and written records also demonstrated that Acadian communities became part of a world of trade that connected from Louisbourg through New England, passing through that region. Despite its strategic location as a center of encounter and exchange, and it also was the site of a disputed border since the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. In fact, prior to 1749, there were no permanent fortifications, British or French, nor established colonial administrative or military presence at Chignecto. For 25 years of a village that was there for 80 years, there wasn't even a church. Chignecto had suffered attacks by New England forces in the late 17th and early 18th century, and had also served as a staging area for French attacks on the British in Nova Scotia during the War of the Austrian Succession, 1744 to 48. During that war, French officers passed through Chignecto towards British targets. They campaigned with limited success, very limited success, for support from the Acadians and the Mi'kmaq. That would be officers coming from Louisbourg via the Northumberland Strait and through Chignecto. The Mi'kmaq were often described as the allies of the French, but the friendship and alliance of the Mi'kmaq was decided upon according to circumstances and imperatives. This alliance was not to be taken for granted. Although many researchers have described the missionaries, who were the French missionaries, as having had a large influence on the Mi'kmaq in getting them to participate in the wars, William Wiccan argues that both during and after 1744, missionaries encountered obstacles in trying to shape Mi'kmaq actions in ways consistent with French interests. So at this point, I'd like to address the military narrative of Chignecto, which was centered on the disputes that led to the construction of 2 forts on the isthmus, basically facing each other in 1750. I would like to illuminate some incidents that occurred there in the 1750s that I would argue received generally pretty short shrift in the narrative of the 7 Years' Wars, being seen just as a precursor to more important events that happened later and elsewhere. But this map by Thomas Jeffers in 1755 does give you the location of the 2 forts, the red dots. So this is Fort Lawrence, and this is Fort Beausejour, later renamed Fort Cumberland, which is the fort that is still standing and you can visit on the site. In the spring of 1750, a force under the command of Charles Lawrence was sent by Governor Edward Le Cornwallis to secure the contested border at the Missaguash River. This border, as I said, had been unclearly defined in the Treaty of Utrecht and was still unresolved by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. As Lawrence's ships advanced up the Bay of Fundy toward the Acadian village of Beaubassin, They saw that the buildings were on fire. This village, home to some 700 people, was in the process of being burnt to the ground. The Acadians homeless would be forced to relocate in territory claimed by the French on the west side of the Mississauga River. The Mi'kmaq were usually named as responsible for the fires, either solely or with French soldiers in the correspondence and the military and contemporary accounts. And most accounts, many accounts, considered the actions of the Mi'kmaq to have been entirely inspired by their missionary priest, l'Abbé Jean-Louis Leloutre. Historians since have both demonized and a few have praised Leloutre for his role in active resistance or violence, but his role as the leader of the Mi'kmaq generally remains unquestioned. Such an interpretation, however, ignores Mi'kmaq and Acadian agency and fails to consider what considerations shaped their response to the British arrival. These events in 1750 follow immediately after the 1749 establishment at Chignecto of a new British capital for the colony that the British claimed as Nova Scotia. Mi'kmaq and French responses to that new settlement of Halifax, which had 6 times the settler population, or tried to have, and 4 times the garrison of the former British capital at Annapolis Royal, were immediate and multifaceted. The French were constrained by the recent treaty and their lack of resources. Some Mi'kmaq made attempts at diplomacy, but some others responded to further settlements with violence. Ultimately, Cornwallis determined the Mi'kmaq were his enemy along with the French. He sent troops to secure positions at Pisiquid, where they built Fort Edward on the site of the Acadian church, which they destroyed, and at Chignecto. The resistance that the British encountered at Chignecto was considerable. The Indigenous peoples present included Mi'kmaq of Chignecto and a group of 50 formerly of the village of Sibonagadic, who had come with the missionary Leloutre. The other half of the community of Sibonagadic had remained there with their chief, Jean-Baptiste Cope. There were also Wolastoqey from the St. John River region, and there were some Acadians. When the British under Charles Lawrence arrived, they were unable to land, observing that the French and Mi'kmaq were arranged behind the dikes along the riverbanks and armed, and that buildings in the village were on fire, as I'd said. Forced to land on the north or west bank of the river, Lawrence challenged the French commander Jean-Louis Lecorne, but was unable to complete his mission. The British retreated to return with a superior force in September, then encountering a defense prepared for their return. And I'll just move on because it does result in very good mapping when an area is highly contested, and this map includes a sketch of the fortification on the Beauséjour Ridge. And again, shows the site of the 2 fortifications, but also the small red dots show all of the Acadian villages that were destroyed in 1750 in anticipation of this attack. The British, when they returned in September, described what they encountered. The dike where we found the Indians had been very industrious in throwing up a breastwork and making loopholes with the earth in order to defend themselves when attacked, and a combined force of about 200 French and Acadians. A brief battle followed, with the British advance supported by the cannons of their ships. There were lives lost on both sides, but within a few hours, the British had taken control of the south bank of the river and what was left of the village. So Beaubassin and all of the Acadian villages south of the Mississauga then and east had been destroyed, certainly with the involvement of the French, but dependent on Acadians and Mi'kmaq, I would argue, for the execution. The subsequent construction of the forts ended any possibility of the inhabitants of the region remaining outside the imperial struggle as the opposing garrisons settled in. In the tumultuous years after 1750, both the Acadians and the Mi'kmaq plotted their own course between French and British demands. Acadians who crossed the Mississauga River were confronted with demands to swear an oath of allegiance to the French king. Some resisted. In the years that followed, many Acadians tried to distance themselves from French authority, and some eventually petitioned the British governor to let them swear an oath of loyalty and return to their villages, but they would still want it modified that they wouldn't have to take up arms. This was not accepted. Pardon me. Other Acadians participated with the Mi'kmaq in armed resistance of the British presence. The Mi'kmaq also chose their own course in this difficult period. In the violence that followed the constructions of Fort Lawrence and Beausejour, the French commandant insisted the Mi'kmaq were acting on their own. He did not control them. So at this point, I will pause, partially out of dry throat and partially out of a respect for the time period. I have always got more to say than I planned. But as we approached the exhibit, we challenged ourselves as to how to address this difficult history, how to have it not overwhelm the story of the place, but also how to not shy away from telling difficult and painful stories and giving visitors space to find the narrative, to process without imposing an outcome. This was the site of painful events, events that were crucial in the shaping of Canada, but events that have very different meanings for different people. So in the course of creating the exhibit, we chose to approach it thematically rather than with a narrative or a timeline. This was very important to our Mi'kmaq partners. And then to allow, we thread individual narratives through the story so that people who are looking for a narrative can find a narrative from a perspective that they either relate to or a perspective they don't know that they're interested in learning. We also commissioned new art, which I was quite excited about, which I'm sharing with you, to how to express and to contextualize some of this story. So this exhibit opened this Thursday past at the University of Moncton, and next will be at Millbrook in Truro. And it was a learning process, and it is a process that we also leave space open for the visitors to learn and to respond and to discuss within the exhibit. And in this way, we are hoping to address a pivotal moment in shaping our region that is also a painful moment in a way that respects and has space for different perspectives and different feelings about this very challenging period. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will turn it back over to Tim and to the panel. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much. Now I will welcome our next presenter, Ken Hines. What's it called? There.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Lachlan, for the introduction. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my former commanding officer, comrade, and friend, Colonel Ian McIntyre. Congratulate him on his honor that he received and the other members of the Cape Breton Highlanders Association for all their years of dedication and hard work. Mr. President Dingwall, I think you're here. If not, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My topic is one that you'll probably find is filled with more emotion than anything else because the colors are an emotional symbol. What is that? Okay. Regimental colors are, in many ways, a visual representation of the soul of an infantry regiment. They hold the emblazoned battle honors, which recall significant battles and deeds of the regiment in action. They are intended to foster a sense of pride and loyalty in the hearts of all ranks. In essence, they are a memorial to the great battlefield accomplishments of the regiment, a symbol of the service and sacrifice of soldiers who gave everything they had to their country and for each other. Colors are paraded on the regiment's most important occasions and are often believed to carry the heart and spirit of all those who fought under them. Colors were once, but are no longer, carried into battle. When they were carried into action, they became a visible, unifying call to a regiment in the smoke, noise, and confusion of the battlefield. Colors have had a very long history of being carried into action. Throughout history, their purpose and effect has always been to identify military units and provide a rallying point as far back as the ancient armies of Egypt, Macedonia, Greece, and Rome. The collective term regimental colors is a general description of specific infantry flags, and these have evolved in the British and Canadian armies. It refers to the two flags of a battalion or regiment, the senior of which, the Queen's, or in this case, King's color, and the junior, the regimental color. Together, they are referred to as a stand of colors. The Queen's, or first color, symbolizes the unit's loyalty to the Crown. Prior to the establishment of a Canadian flag, previous colors had the Union Jack as the background on the King's color or Queen's color. The regimental, or second color, symbolizes service and a whole spectrum of ideas, beliefs, and emotions which may be characterized as representing the life of the regiment. It is customary that the regimental color is emblazoned with the names of specific battles in which the regiment took part and where the regiment distinguished itself, a custom that originated sometime around 1784. The Cape Breton Highlanders will now have a new stand of colors, with the regimental color having the following battles emblazoned on it from the First World War: Ypres, 1917, Arras, 1917-18, Vimy, 1917, Passchendaele, Amiens, Drocourt-Quéant, Hindenburg Line, Canal du Nord, Valenciennes, France and Flanders, 1917-18. Those names are very familiar to anyone who knows the history of the Canadian Army during the First World War. These were earned by the 85th Battalion, Nova Scotia Highlanders, the famous Never Fails, which, along with the 185th Battalion, is perpetuated today by the Cape Breton Highlanders. The 85th Battalion colors were presented to the battalion at Camp Aldershot by Lady Borden, spouse of Sir Robert Borden, the 8th Prime Minister of Canada, in 1916. Along with the 185th, the rest of the Nova Scotia Highland Brigade, they proceeded overseas in October of 1916 aboard RMS Olympic, sister ship of the Titanic. The 85th Battalion was the only one of the Highland Brigade to see action in France and Flanders during the Great War. And the remainder, the 185th, the 193rd, 219th, and later the 246th battalions, served as reserve battalions as part of the 5th Canadian Division in the UK, or were broken up for reinforcements. The 85th Battalion returned from overseas on the 7th of June, 1919, and was disbanded in Halifax on the 15th of September, 1920. The battalion was very much a pan-Nova Scotia unit. A few years ago, this map was created by Will Flanagan, a cartographer at St. Mary's University, and his intent was to show the participation of the regiment by the citizens of Nova Scotia, more than 3,100 men joined the colors of the 85th Battalion, many coming from across the Atlantic provinces even, and some from the Mcdonald Islands. Evidence of the sacrifices made by the 85th Battalion at Passchendaele, for example, still stands on the battlefield near that well-known village in Flanders. Within 300 yards of that monument, 148 soldiers of the 85th Battalion died. The original plate that was on the face of the memorial is now on display at the Army Museum in Halifax. But it is clear that the casualty rates and the exploits of the soldiers of the 85th Battalion are certainly well known in that village in Passchendaele. When you walk along the road leading into the village of Passchendaele, there's a massive sign there, you can see it up here, 85th Battalion, Nova Scotia Highlanders Memorial. It was a goosebump moment for me to walk along that road and to stand in that place and contemplate the sacrifice given not only by the 148 who died, but the 1,000 or more who served on that day, on those days during the Battle of Passchendaele. The Vimy National Memorial crowns the summit of Hill 145, where the 85th did what no other unit could do in April of 1917. The untested, so-called Ugly Duckling Battalion, derisively known as the Highlanders without kilts, they captured the highest point of ground on the ridge. After the redesignation of a number of regiments between 1871 and 1920, the Cape Breton Highlanders were established on the 29th of March, 1920. Their distinguished service during the Second World War is recognized by the following battle honors being emblazoned on the new regimental color: Melfa Crossing, Caprano, Gothic Line, Montecchio, Coriano, Limone Crossing, Fosso Munio, Italy, 1944-45, Isselmere, the Delft-Gilles Pocket. As part of the 11th Canadian Infantry Brigade, 5th Canadian Armoured Division, the Cape Breton Highlanders fought in so many tough battles up the boot of Italy, later in Northwest Europe, and certainly during the liberation of Holland. Several battle honors were earned in the First and Second World War by the 85th Battalion and the Cape Breton Highlanders that are not emblazoned on the regimental color. For the Great War, these are Scarpe, 1918, and Sambre. For the Second World War, they are Leary Valley, Conventello, Camacchio, and Northwest Europe, 1945. Well, why are they not emblazoned? There are limits placed on emblazonment, and only 10 battles from the First and the Second World War can be emblazoned, and the choice of those battles is left up to each regiment. As a prelude to where we are today, on the 21st of June, 1955, the Cape Breton Highlanders were redesignated 2nd Battalion, the Nova Scotia Highlanders, Cape Breton, and they received their colors here in Sydney in 1959. The original colors of the 85th Battalion are laid up at Government House in Halifax, along with those of the 25th Battalion, Nova Scotia Rifles. These were the only 2 of 11 Nova Scotia-raised infantry battalions that fought in battle during the First World War and were not broken up for reinforcements. The colors of the 2nd Battalion, the Nova Scotia Highlanders Cape Breton, are currently located in the Officers' Mess at Victoria Park. Soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, the Nova Scotia Highlanders, and later the Cape Breton Highlanders served in Afghanistan throughout the period 2002 to 2014. The 2nd Battalion, the Nova Scotia Highlanders Cape Breton, was reorganized and redesignated as a separate regiment, finally, the Cape Breton Highlanders on the 9th of December 2010. And following the conflict in Afghanistan, that battle honor was granted to the Cape Breton Highlanders. With the presentation of new colors later today, the collective history and service of the regiment and its forebearers is updated, preserved, and commemorated. Well, what about the old stands of colors? Old colors are normally laid up in memorial chapels or churches with due reverence until sometimes centuries later, rotted by time, they fall, and then, like fallen heroes, many have been given actual burials with full military honors. As I pointed out, and unusually, the 85th Battalion colors are on display at Government House in Halifax, where they were deposited when the battalion came home from overseas in 1919. Those of the 2nd Battalion, Nova Scotia Highlanders, Cape Breton, are still with us here in Sydney. Their fate will be determined by the regiment in due course. When at Government House a few months ago, I once again visited with the 85th Battalion colors. And I couldn't help but recall these few well-chosen words. A moth-eaten rag on a worm-eaten pole, it does not look likely to stir a man's soul. 'Tis the deeds that were done neath the moth-eaten rag when the pole was a staff and the rag was a flag. These words were written by Sir Edward Hamley on seeing some old colors of the 32nd Regiment of Foot in Monmouth Church in Wales in 1899, and it kind of speaks to what the colors would mean to a regiment and its history. The association of colors with heroic deeds has caused them to be viewed as a sacred reminder of service and sacrifice. They visually capture and enshrine the active service of the regiment and the memory of warriors no longer with us. Today, although I'm always tempted, I've not drilled too far into the great details of the wartime exploits of the 85th Battalion or the Cape Breton Highlanders. Those are stories and journeys best taken by everyone individually at another time. Suffice to say, Nova Scotia soldiers and the Highlanders of Cape Breton have punched well above their weight class on so many occasions. To aid in a personal journey of discovery, I commend two books to you. First, Nova Scotia's Part in the Great War by M. Stuart Hunt, written in 1920, and The Breed of Manly Men, The History of the Cape Breton Highlanders by Alex Morrison and Ted Slaney. However, I do want to leave you with the thoughts of a British author and former Royal Marine Robert Nealance from his book, Great War Generals on the Western Front. When writing about the Canadian victory at Vimy Ridge, he said, "The Nova Scotia Highlanders took Hill 145 the only way it could be taken that day, with the bayonet, the grenade, the Lewis gun, and guts. The sheer tenacity and fighting spirit of the Highlanders' assault so dismayed and terrified the defenders, they quickly began to abandon their trenches or surrender to a wave of charging, yelling Canadians who sprayed the trenches with Lewis guns fired from the hip, flung or fired huge numbers of grenades, and leapt down from the parapets to root out and vanquish the Germans with their bayonets. Nothing could stop them. And when Hill 145 had fallen, the Highlanders pressed on down the far side of the slope until their commanders had to restrain them from exceeding their orders and call them back. Those commanders were Captain Harvey Kroll of C Company from Yarmouth, who was wounded in action and mentioned in dispatches at Vimy, and Captain Percy Anderson of D Company, who's from Big Bedeck, received the Military Cross for his actions, and sadly, a little more than 6 months later, was killed in action at Passchendaele. Good training can only go so far in explaining how this magnificent feat of arms was accomplished. It's clear, at least to me, that the unquantifiable elements of heart, spirit, comradeship, and determination played more than an equal role in the result on that Easter Monday over a century ago. The presentation, consecration, and carrying of colors are time-honored traditions steeped in historical and emotional meaning. As long as a regiment lives, its colors tell the story of immeasurable service and sacrifice. Colors are the stilled hearts of those who now lie at peace in faraway lands. The spirits of those who served under them are always with us, and our mission is to remain worthy of their sacrifices in places where now only the embroidered battle's name can be seen on parade. A few words, places in a distant land, on simple cloth. They speak volumes on the virtues of and the price of honor, duty, courage, and service before self. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tim, for the introduction, and also thanks to Lachlan for bringing everyone together today. I'm pleased to be here to speak about our local efforts to document the island's military service and heritage, and specifically the most recent project focused on the Cape Breton Highlanders and the 150th anniversary. Also, considering this week's focus on truth and reconciliation, I'd like to recognize and acknowledge that I'm grateful to be able to live and work on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Ulnu. Thanks, Chris. We've been working on a decolonial approach to our work over the past decade, but most recently we've heeded the call to action number 70 in the TRC report. That really identifies the work that archives need to complete. Through this project, we've identified archival silences and gaps in our holdings of Indigenous created records and even records related to any Indigenous military service. But we have started to build relationships to move this work forward. So during the talk, I'll provide a brief introduction to the Beaton Institute, a review of archival projects and collections through the lens of engagement with faculty, students, and community, followed by our most recent CBH project, and concluding with how we communicate and tell our stories with the public and other organizations. Before I continue speaking about the archival work, I was thinking about how the Cape Breton Highlanders have been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. So pictured here are my grandparents, Carl and Evelyn Arnold, and some here may have known my grandfather, as he was involved with the CBH almost his entire life. So here he is in front of the Colosseum in Rome while in Italy. He was working as a young man at the steel plant in the rolling and rod mills when he joined the NPAN, or Non-Permanent Active Militia. He completed a few training programs, including small arms training at Connaught Ranges, and by the time war broke out, he had joined the Highlanders as lieutenant and was an officer during the war. It was interesting to listen to Tim yesterday talk about many things, but also the kinship between veterans as a constant, because that was absolutely my grandfather's focus whenever he talked about his military service. He didn't speak directly about his time in Italy, understandably, but I learned a lot through the publication Breed of Manly Men. So his time in the military led to a career in social services, and he was also proud of his role as aide-de-camp to Governor General Vanier. The most popular wartime story told in my family is the one of my dad meeting his father. My grandmother gave birth to my father after my grandfather had deployed for England, and my grandfather didn't get to meet his son until he was 3 years old. The story's always told with a chuckle how my father wasn't keen on obeying this new stranger who was used to people following his orders. However, I really regret not asking my grandmother what her life was like at that time, to have a toddler and a newborn as a single parent during wartime, or what the transition was like when the men returned home. So rarely do projects have such personal components for me, but finding photographs and war diary entries about my grandfather has reinforced how the work that we do has great impact. The best part of the job is connecting researchers or patrons to the stories they're searching for, and for the evidence of important actions or events that can change perceptions and narratives. So the next few slides will explore how the Beaton, we're trying our best to meet our researchers' needs and expectations and encourage the joy of discovery of archival resources. So the Beaton Institute is a cultural heritage archive that operates with a regional mandate for all of Cape Breton Island. We originated as part of Xavier Junior College, located downtown Sydney, and moved to the CBU campus in the 1970s and the current location in 1998. For those that attended the Tour of Valor, it was the thoroughfare between South Africa and France. Collecting at the archive was initially based on cultural collections, Gaelic, Celtic content, and early Cape Breton and industrial history, which was spearheaded by Sister Margaret Beaton, the archive's namesake. So the next director of the archive, the late Dr. Robert Morgan, along with CBU professors like Dr. Brian Tennyson and the late Dr. Don McGilvery, expanded the scope of the collections and research to include Loyalist refugees, early military history, labor history, and military presence in Cape Breton. Also personal papers of those who served, like Percy Wilmot, who was with the Canadian Expeditionary Forces 25th Battalion during the First World War. Brian Tennyson has published a book about Percy's life called A Cape Bretoner at War, 1914-1919. Although the manuscript group for the Cape Breton Highlanders MG 20.5 is relatively small, the number of discrete items like photographs, pamphlets, combined with personal collection, audio interviews, newspapers, etc., collectively create a significant set of records providing a broad representation of military service and war over a span of approximately 3 centuries. So over the past number of years, the Beaton Institute has been completing various archival projects related to military milestones and anniversaries. These projects are generally framed as opportunities for engagement with faculty research, student coursework, and/or community collaborations. So the Guide to the World War I holdings includes an audit of our collections and is organized into categories based on format, like audiovisual, manuscript groups, textual documents. The document is searchable, and some of the digital objects and scans have been attached to the descriptions in our digital archive. Like the Cape Breton Highlanders Anniversary Project, this was funded through a provincial archival development grant, which is a small pot of money but essential for how these projects get completed. We've also collaborated in the past with Parks Canada and the Cape Breton Regional Library to complete an online project focused on the work and life of Catherine Mclennan. Daughter to Senator J.S. Mclennan, Catherine served as a nursing sister overseas in France during the First World War, and on her return was instrumental in setting up blood collection services here in Cape Breton. She was also a key figure in the heritage and culture field and worked as the first curator at the Louisbourg Museum, built in the 1930s. A nice aspect of the project pre-COVID was that we had sort of a legacy award that was established to celebrate volunteerism in honor of Catherine, and I believe 7 have been presented so far to individuals across the island. Voices of Heritage was a modest oral history project with local World War II veterans and war brides, but the stories captured were significant and poignant. Heritage Cape Breton Connection is a network of local heritage organizations on the island, and the Beaton Institute facilitated the project as a member of that board. So as I mentioned earlier, the archive has been fortunate to receive funding from the PADP to assist with work focused on the preservation and access of records related to the history and legacy of the CBH. So we've been able to partner with the Cape Breton Highlanders Association and continue our work with now Dr. John Clark at the Highlanders Museum. So it's also been a great opportunity to work with Mitch Jabley, who presented yesterday about James Murphy. Mitch is a former CBU student who completed the Beaton Institute's 6-credit internship, and he's now working with other unprocessed collections like the Lewis family phone, which includes images on this slide. So we're still gathering information about the Lewis collection, which seems to date around 1936, as the images were found with a set of photos that captured aviator Beryl Markham as well, and her plane crash at Balling that year. The PEI Highlanders are also included in the images, so that might help narrow down the dates and locations. Possibly they're in PEI. And eventually these will be shared widely online, and engagement through social media might bring forward even more information, as it has successfully done in the past through our channels, or the Cape Breton Military Showcase run by Robert Mclennan and the Highlanders Association page. The other collection to be processed is the Charles Sharkey Mcdonald phone, which many of you are probably familiar with. So Mcdonald was born in 1922 in New Waterford. He enjoyed boxing and hockey, and his nickname Sharkey was given because of his resemblance to boxer Jack Sharkey. His passion for boxing would carry into his time in the military, where he won the lightweight crown in a competition among the 5th Canadian Armoured Division in 1945 at the end of the war. So Mcdonald enlisted with Cape Breton Highlanders in 1940 and served in A Company overseas in England, Italy, where he was injured, and Holland. After the war, Mcdonald would become a founding member of the Cape Breton Highlanders Association and worked to establish the Cenotaph Memorial on Kings Road. In 1975, Mcdonald was one of 2 men chosen to represent the Cape Breton Highlanders unit in the Canadian pilgrimage to Italy to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the liberation of Italy. In post-war years, Mcdonald worked for over 40 years as a miner for the Dominion Coal Company and as a security guard for Devco. He also served 17 years as counselor for New Waterford, so very well known locally as well as with the CBH. The collection contains a variety of images that range from wartime photographs of the Highlanders overseas, period newspaper clippings that chronicle the unit's wartime service, photographs from many Highlander reunions, and records related to the 30th anniversary of the liberation of Italy. As part of the project, the collection will be digitized and placed online in the Beaton Institute Digital Archive, with added physical arrangement and rehousing for preservation purposes. So this collection illustrates the importance of community-driven or collaborative projects. As a small shop with 1 archivist and a large backlog of collections, we are reactive rather than proactive when it comes to processing collections, including full finding aids and online presence. The 150th anniversary has provided the opportunity to successfully apply for funding and then move forward with a collection that hasn't been, sadly, publicly accessible for over 25 years. So this certainly gives me pause when considering conversation yesterday with calls to do more to promote and raise visibility for the CBH. So you can certainly get lost in the images, which I did the other night. I did a quick search to see what I could learn about the gentleman in the photo. There's Mick or Mike Daniluk, George Moss, and Tommy Morrison here. I could only find George Moss's obituary and learn that, sadly, he passed away in 2009. He was from Newfoundland and actually signed up with the CBH. I was able to contact his son, William, and we struck up a conversation that led to more information about George and his time overseas, including a story of how Captain Boyden, the CBH medic, saved his life. William also plans to put me in touch with another friend whose father served with the Highlanders, and it's been a great connection to make, and I plan to continue the conversation. It really wouldn't have happened without this project. So other records being digitized include pamphlets, newspapers, and the War Diaries. The War Diaries, as most of you know, are extremely rich in information, include daily details of the Highlanders' movements and actions between 1939 and 46. In archives, you can receive wonderful surprises, but often the surprises are frustrating. We'd intended to use our spiffy new microfilm scanner, courtesy of Dr. McKinnon, to auto-scan the War Diaries, but discovered that the microfilm wasn't appropriate for clear scans. So fortunately, we contacted Library and Archives Canada and were able to purchase complete scans of at least half the run of the War Diaries from 43 to 46. The other half, we've been provided copies from the Highlander Museum, and we'll be scanning those by hand by individual pages. These will be then shared back with the museum. Oh, there we are. We're also digitizing as much of the Highlanders Museum collection as possible and returning the digital files to include in a future database or online platform to promote the holdings and the rich history at the museum. Currently, we have a number of separate discrete items and collections spread over multiple platforms without a complete guide or finding aid. For example, this amazing film footage taken on September 4th, 1939 by the late Malcolm F. McNeill captured on film Major Gordon McNeill and his men heading to encampment at Badek following Prime Minister Chamberlain's declaration of war on Germany the day prior. The men are filmed leaving Grand Narrows for Iona by train and on to Badek from Iona on the mailboat. We also hold additional information on our digital archive page. So we'd like to combine this information and add this and other floating resources to an overall guide. Additionally, many of our descriptions are vague or incomplete, or at times just plain wrong. So we intend to pull all the CBH content together into a larger page, expanding on the World War I guide, with attention to improving the descriptive information and cross-referencing. So this photo is of Andrew and Roddy Stevens, two Mi'kmaq Highlanders believed to have been taken in England between 41 and 43. The original photo is in the Charles Mcdonald collection, but we noticed a copy of the image was posted on the CB Military Showcase Facebook site, and the post asked for more information. Darren Stevens, who was a nephew of Roddy and Andrew, not only confirmed that their third brother, Benedict, his father, also served overseas, but they were reunited with him after he was injured by a bomb explosion. They were sitting on the hospital steps when their brother was unexpectedly brought in on a stretcher. Roddy and Andrew didn't know Benedict had enlisted illegally, lying about his age, and were shocked to find him being brought into the hospital. Darren had heard this story from his mother and shared this extraordinary tale online. So we do find that although digital archives, social media, and an online presence doesn't replace on-site archival research or confirming your sources and stories, it can be very effective at reaching the public, telling and gathering stories, and increasing visibility of the archive and our island's heritage. Having additional access points for content can also be valuable to reach new audiences. So to wrap up, I just want to bring attention to the Digital Museums of Canada project that includes 4 stories of Cape Bretoners who served during the First World War. Both Mitch Jabley and Lachlan Mckinnon have provided excellent presentations about James Murphy and Anthony Sumeski. This was an extremely challenging project in terms of capacity and ability to meet funder expectations. Brian Tennyson provided valuable input around the content, and after many delays, it appears the site will finally launch this November. So the site contains a number of audio and video productions, including this dramatized reading of James Murphy's letters. We worked with Todd Hiscock at the Boardmore, and one of our students narrates the part of Murphy. We might have time for a minute. I don't know. Okay. I have to go ahead. We'll see if it works.
I will begin in Marguerite, Cape Breton, when I was 16. I was the 5th child of a family of 8 born to James Murphy and Julia Cody. At that time, our country school was closed, and no further education was available. I left home and my first job was in a coal mine. There, for 2 years, I spent almost 50% of my life underground and doing the job of a grown man. Naturally, my mother kept in touch with me and seemed to think that I could do better. She had a first cousin, Dr. Jimmy Tompkins, who was vice president of St. Francis Xavier College, and another cousin, Dr. Moses Cody, a professor in the same college. So she arranged with them so that I got into the college to complete high school. I started the first year of college when the First World War broke out. As a result, the Royal Military College of Canada was permitted to send students depending on the college enrollment. St. Francis Xavier was allowed to send 1 student. I was picked to go. My Army career began in August 1915. I got a commission as lieutenant, and went to England as a platoon commander in April 1916. I asked for active duty in France and joined the 46th Battalion Canadian Infantry on their way to the Somme front in September 1916. I was junior officer of 7 in C Company, 46th Battalion, when we were sent to the Somme.
October 25th, 1916. My dear father, I am leaving for the front this evening. Don't worry about me. I'll have as good a chance of coming out as anyone. I am your loving son, Jim.
I'll stop there. So thank you very much.
Okay, and so thank you to the 3 presenters already. Next, we have a presentation that was sent to us by Wes Cross, and I believe we'll just play the presentation, and then after that, we'll have a period for questions where we can ask any of the presenters questions about their topics.
Not lost at sea. Today, I'm going to briefly bring back to life the Ajax Club of wartime Halifax. Although it lasted only about 18 months, it became an internationally known story of naval life ashore during the Second World War. It is a local story that had an unexpectedly larger role in the development of Canada. Beyond the tale about to be shared, you'll be able to see its most enduring artifacts, the Ajax Naval Collection, for the first time in 30 years. It will recount the efforts and legacy of an individual woman in a world and time when the barriers against almost any such achievement were solidly in place. The stark reality of the Second World War arrived early in Halifax with the news of the sinking of the liner Athenia, bound from Liverpool to Montreal on the first day of the war, with the loss of 128 lives. A few days later, 200 survivors arrived in Halifax aboard the cargo ship SS City of Flint. Almost immediately, a convoy system was initiated to provide protection for merchant vessels. This would thrust Halifax directly into the longest continuous campaign of the war, known as the Battle of the Atlantic, which would last until May 1945. The naval presence in Halifax at the outset was small. The Royal Canadian Navy had only 6 ocean-going ships in total, with half stationed in the Pacific. As a result, Canada once again would have to rely upon the Royal Navy for initial support and convoy escort. To paraphrase a well-known patriotic song, Britannia would have to rule the waves. The first convoy departed Halifax Harbour on September 16, 1939, and would be followed by 376 additional convoys consisting of over 20,000 ships in total over the next 6 years. For the first 2 years, Halifax was the most important port in the Western Atlantic for the war effort, having direct rail connections to Central North America. Other ports, such as Sydney and St. John's, were hampered by the need for ferry connections and the lack of ship maintenance and repair facilities. This traffic created a bottleneck in Bedford Basin, as there could be up to 100 ships arriving or awaiting a convoy assignment. With some ships waiting weeks between sailings, Halifax was overwhelmed by throngs of merchant and naval crews on shore leave seeking entertainment, a drink, and a break from the terror and stress of the Atlantic crossings. These fears were well-founded. 3,500 merchant vessels and 175 warships were lost, resulting in a total of 72,000 deaths. Canadian wartime Minister of Transport J.E. Michaud had declared that merchant seamen virtually formed the fourth arm of the fighting services. In 1939, Halifax was a community still struggling to recover from the Depression. The response to the sudden need to accommodate a massive influx of thousands of sailors fell upon volunteer organizations such as the YMCA, Knights of Columbus, Salvation Army, and independent church and private initiatives. Their activities were constrained by financial issues and the lack of adequate facilities. However, to many of the sailors, the largest issue was the strict liquor licensing laws that made it impossible for a sailor to purchase beer or alcohol except from local bootleggers. Into this new wartime environment, Dr. Stuart McEwen arrived from Montreal. Dr. McEwen had resigned his position at the Royal Victoria Hospital as a medical researcher to enlist in the Royal Canadian Naval Reserve. The rapid expansion of the Canadian Navy was underway, and the need for medical officers was a priority. He was immediately posted to HMCS Stadacona, the RCN shore installation in Halifax. Accompanying him was his wife, Janet McEwen, who was universally known as Dolly. The McEwens were born in the UK and were proudly Scottish. They had married in Canada, and Stuart graduated from McGill with a medical degree in 1920. They returned to the UK before once again coming to Canada to stay in 1933. Arriving in Halifax in September of 1939, and with Dr. McEwen busy with official duties at the naval base, Dolly dove into the world of local volunteer organizations. She initially worked with the North End Services Canteen, but found their organization and aims fell short of her ideals. Dolly, it turns out, was a force of nature, and as a result, soon decided to strike out on her own. She created the Inter-Allied Hospitality Fund, and through this, Dolly was able to raise money to begin to realize her own vision. Initially, this was limited to local excursions and picnic gatherings, but soon fell upon the idea for a service club. With a trio of official patrons, comprising Rear Admiral Stuart Bonham Carter of the Royal Navy, Royal Canadian Navy Chief of Naval Staff Percy Nels, and Premier Angus L. Mcdonald, she began implementing her plan in May 1940. Her efforts were aimed at Royal Navy ratings and the crews of the RCN and sought out appropriate premises to entertain them. She was able to secure a lease on an old and unused mansion of 25 rooms. Although in desperate need of repair and renovation, she was able to transform the building through work parties assigned to the task from the two navies. Incredibly, she was also able to convince provincial authorities to issue a private club license to serve beer. This was quite a coup given the strong pro-temper stance of government officials, but fulfilled Dolly's belief that the men deserved a glass of beer in decent surroundings. The completed facility featured a library, lounges, and a bar, and was eventually named the Ajax Club, using the insignia and motto from the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Ajax. The selection of the name is real curiosity, given that the Ajax had never visited Halifax before or during the war. Dolly revealed that the name was chosen since it was the best-known Royal Navy vessel at the time. One of 3 cruisers to engage the pocket battleship Graf Spee off the coast of Uruguay, the subsequent scuttling and sinking of the German warship was a major news story around the world in December 1939. The Ajax Club officially opened in November 1940 and was an immediate hit with the naval ratings. However, local resistance began immediately. A major problem was that across the street from the club was the Fort Massey United Church. By coincidence, a prominent member of the congregation was the new Nova Scotia Premier, Alexander Mcmillan. Having a sailors' club serving beer on the same street was just not to be tolerated. Ironically, another problem was the displeasure of local bootleggers who felt that their black market sales were now lagging. As a result of this tension, Dolly on at least one occasion was convoyed home by Royal Navy sailors. The club hosted a number of high-profile visitors, such as the Governor General and his wife Princess Alice, and Prime Minister Mackenzie King. An invited non-visitor was the Reverend Gerald Rogers, the new pastor of the Fort Massey Church, who stated that a Christian gentleman would not cross such a threshold. Accusations of excessive drinking on and outside of the premises were made by the church's leaders. Charges of promiscuous behavior in the garden were dealt with by Dolly, ringing the club perimeter with donated barbed wire to keep sex workers at bay. A struggle began between Dolly, the naval authorities backing her, and the temperance movement. This culminated in February 1942 when, under tremendous pressure, the Ajax Club's beer license was revoked, depriving the Ajax of their beer sales, 90% of the club's annual revenue. Undaunted, Dolly announced her intent by climbing on top of the Ajax bar and announcing to all in attendance that she intended to continue the battle. The result was a barrage of newspaper stories across Canada, and eventually, the story even made its way into Time magazine. The issue was also raised on the floor of the House of Commons. Hundreds of letters of support were sent, including some from very prominent individuals, such as Hugh Mclennan, who deemed it a tempest in a beer mug. And one academic wrote a stinging letter suggesting that the Fort Massey Church itself should be fenced off to protect citizens rather than the club. Dolly was involved in multiple complicated attempts to forge a compromise, but the final blow came a couple months later when the Federal National War Services Department froze the assets of the club, and the Ajax Club ceased to exist in May 1942. As a result of the closure of the Ajax Club, Halifax, already known as the least favorite Atlantic port for sailors, roundly received public criticism for the treatment of sailors during wartime. On May 8th and 9th, 1945, that displeasure was infamously illustrated in the VE Day riots. What caused the demise of the club after 18 months of successful operation? There were a combination of culprits. An important change occurred when Angus L. Mcdonald resigned as Premier in favor of Alexander Macmillan. Angus went to Ottawa to join the federal cabinet as Minister of Naval Services and wished to distance himself from the issue of the club. Macmillan was a strong supporter of the temperance movement and a member of the Fort Massey Church. Reputedly, his wife was the target of a remark by a sailor attending the church, which may have increased the motivation to close the club. Also, changes to the North Atlantic convoy system were taking place beginning in July 1941, resulting in a much depleted Royal Navy presence in Halifax. Never one to fully surrender, Dolly lobbied the National War Services Department to grant a new charter and purpose, and the result was the Ajax Hospitality Headquarters, which opened in August 1942. This was no longer run as a private service club, but more a storefront operation to find places of rest and recreation outside of Halifax. Under the new agreement, the new Ajax was restricted to the Royal Navy ratings alone. However, Dolly expanded this definition to include the crews of the defensively equipped merchant ships, the DEMS, Fleet Air Arm, and the Maritime Royal Artillery Servicemen as well. The new sailors were from the civilian ships hastily converted into armed merchant cruisers by adding some fighting ability to them, such as modest guns, catapult aircraft, and eventually merchant aircraft carriers. These sailors were drawn from other branches of the British military and were designed to provide an auxiliary escort for convoys. Having lost a substantial beer revenue from the Ajax Club closure, Dolly created Ajax Financial Campaign Committees in Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, and Windsor, which provided sufficient funding. She also undertook national tours to promote the welfare of sailors and the role that Ajax Hospitality was playing in Halifax. In all, she raised almost $6 million in today's dollars. With the end of the war and the winding up of the Ajax operations in Halifax in September 1945, all that remained were a collection of donated ship artifacts. The McEwens had returned to their home at Mont Tremblant, Quebec, and Dolly began a correspondence with McGill University Principal F. Cyril James about finding a home for the ship's crests. The collection of naval badges and crests had been given to the Ajax during the war. A small number were official ship's badges and tampions, but most were homemade crests crafted by grateful crew. The collection had begun in 1941 with the crest from the HMS Royal Sovereign and grew to a total of 48 by war's end. Keen to exploit her connections in the Admiralty, she requested badges for all Royal Navy ships who had put into Halifax during the war. In a spirited exchange of letters, she was reluctantly forced to accept a symbolic 20 HMS crests to represent the estimated 5,000 Royal Navy visits. Never one to rest, Dolly in the meantime had also convinced the RCN that the lack of Canadian representation in the Battle of the Atlantic Memorial at McGill would be an embarrassment. 20 RCN badges hurriedly arrived at McGill as well as a result. This now brought the McGill collection total to 88 badges and overwhelmed the planners and architects. The university planned to display the collection in the new War Memorial Sports Complex then being designed. They would be placed in a new auditorium to commemorate the Battle of the Atlantic. However, the auditorium element was removed from the final plans for financial reasons. As a compromise, 49 of the 88 crests were finally mounted on a wall in the Sir Arthur Currie Armory and Gymnasium. A plaque was later affixed below the mounted collection which said, "In tribute to the memory of the officers and men of the Royal Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Maritime Royal Artillery." Dolly continued to pressure McGill to mount the remainder of the badges, but the university declined, stating that the uninstalled ones were less attractive or in poor condition and would not be added. The Ajax collection remained on display in the Curry Gymnasium for 40 years, until 1990. Then they were removed to storage to allow for the major additions to the complex. For the next 17 years, the display badges lay crated and over time faded from memory. In 2007, the existence of the crates was reported by a staff member who was emptying the storage area. The collection was quickly rescued and now resides safely in the McGill University archives. Of the original 88 artifacts donated, 54 still exist. The majority of the lost artifacts are those from the Ajax Club itself, primarily those of the armed merchant ships. Of the 25 originally in the collection, only 5 remain. This is a shame because the merchant marine crests constitute handmade trench art and some may have been one of a kind. Perhaps the most valued artifact is the badge from the HMS Ajax itself, presented to Dolly in May 1943. In Halifax, it was positioned in a place of honor above all other ships in her collection. It's been painted with the wrong colors, stolen and returned, but part of its story was unknown until I contacted Albert Robb, a gunnery officer from the HMS Ajax, who has provided some invaluable information on the artifact. He remembers the brass tampons being affixed to the main guns in July 1940 for press photographers and never used again once the ship was operational. He explained the damage visible was the result of being in a storage locker that was hit by a shell during the battle off Crete. Albert is now 103 years old and is both surprised and delighted by the discovery that part of his guns is in Canada. And the McEwens? Dolly and Stuart McEwen continued to live at Mont Tremblant with frequent trips to Montreal and McGill. Dr. McEwen passed away in 1956 and Dolly continued to reside on the estate until the late 1960s when she moved to Ottawa. Dolly continued her effort to mount the balance of the Ajax collection to the memorial wall, but to no avail. In 1968, 23 years after she donated them to McGill, she formally requested an investigation by the RCMP into the missing crests and into McGill itself. The RCMP politely declined to pursue the matter. A common question I receive is, why was the Ajax collection in Montreal and not Halifax? The answer is many-sided. Dolly herself stated 80% of the fundraising came from Montreal during the war. Her husband was a McGill graduate, and the family had a long relationship with the institution. Finally, Dolly had no great affection for Halifax, and in some quarters the feeling was likely mutual. Janet Evelyn Dolly McEwen passed away in 1987 at the age of 96. The Halifax Chronicle Herald described her as a Halifax wartime figure who battled temperance forces, bootleggers, and provincial and federal politicians from her Halifax club. An indication of how she viewed the importance of her work in Halifax was indicated in her lifelong preference for being referred to as Mrs. Ajax.
All right, I would ask Wes and Anne-Marie to turn on their cameras. I see they've done so already. Thanks for 4 wonderful papers dealing with heritage, memory, and kind of landscape presentation of these important histories. And now we have some time for questions. So any questions for any of the presenters? All right, Ian. Check. Okay.
Thank you. Actually, perhaps I should say Ian McIntyre, Cape Breton Highlanders Association. I have a few names I'd like to drop, starting with Dr. Lachlan Mckinnon for arranging such an excellent and eclectic morning. Very, very interesting, all topics. I would also like to mention, I would be remiss, as a matter of fact, if I did not refer to my friend and colleague, Ken Hines, for his excellent presentation on the colors that we're going to be seeing in a couple of hours' time, and their significance, very well taken. And also, I would like to mention Jane Arnold, who talked about her grandfather. I had the honor of serving under Lieutenant Colonel Carl Arnold when I joined 100 years ago in 1956. And I also had the pleasure of talking with some of the folks that served under Company Commander Major Carl Arnold in the Italian campaign, and they had great things to say about your grandfather. And as most of us know, Cape Breton Highlanders didn't usually throw bouquets at officers that they didn't appreciate and honor. I can guarantee you that one. So, in closing, thank you very, very much once again, and Jane. Oh, I should also mention, later Lieutenant Colonel Carl Arnold became Brigadier Arnold and commanded the 3 militia group with headquarters in Sydney. And once they made the brigadier rank Brigadier General, I made the mistake of referring to him as Brigadier General Arnold one time, and I was quickly explained that brigadiers command brigades. Brigadier General is something new. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Any other questions?
Tim Cook from the Canadian War Museum. This is a question for Ann Jonah. Your exhibition sounds fascinating. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about some of the challenges. You touched on this a little bit, I think, on consultation and enabling and ensuring that there are multiple voices for the exhibition. You talked about the contested nature of the space and the stories. Maybe you can give us an example of really one of those difficult questions that you struggled with perhaps in presenting an aspect of the history, and how did you come to the solution there? It's not always easy in the museum environment or in history or archives when you're limited to 150 words or a work of art to capture some of those complexities, but maybe you can shed a little bit of light on that, pull back the curtain perhaps, and give us some insight.
Thanks for the question, Tim. There were certainly a lot of challenges because of the newness of the approach and just that reality of, I mean, there are a lot of jokes about things built by committees or created by committees, but ultimately we did really feel like we learned so much in the creation process for the project. But I would say there were many innovative things that we turned to help us create a balance that everyone involved could live with, because the story meant such different things to different people, and when people felt like the story that they wanted to tell was being lost, that was a challenge, and we had to really compromise and work through that. I would say just sort of in process approaches, one of the ways that we created a compromise was to have that thematic base. So there's art based on themes that centers the whole exhibit, rather than having a timeline, because somehow with the timeline, there's an inevitability, it imposes a weight of importance as to what shows up on the line, what doesn't. So the themes allowed us to look at it in a different way. But personally, as somebody really tied to dates, myself, and narrative, I then felt like we still needed to anchor it somehow in a findable narrative. So the exhibit does not impose a timeline, but it does It contains individual narratives of people who lived through this period, or different parts of the period are sewn throughout the exhibit, connected to the archaeological objects, connected to some of the documents, connected to the spaces. And if people choose to, they actually can pick up kind of a worksheet at the beginning and choose a person's story to follow through to help them piece together the narrative of the period, but still have some sense. And one of the things I felt strongly about was that this approach allowed people to see that we always choose a narrative. We always choose pieces to put together a story, and that means that there are other pieces that are set aside. And I, you know, it just opened, so we'll see how people respond to that. But it was the challenge we face is including multiple perspectives in a way that people can still make connections to a story in it. So I hope that gives you some sense of what we worked with, but I will say, like, occasionally there may have been perspiration, there may have been frustration, and there were definitely some compromises, but there was a lot of learning.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. We have time for a couple more questions if anybody has any. I have a question for Wes then. Wes, I'd like you to speak to maybe what challenges did you face in kind of pulling together all the evidence on, you know, on the story of this collection, and you know, tracing it all the way from, you know, early beginnings until where it wound up today in the archive in Montreal.
Well, sure. Yeah, it's an interesting story because the McGill University Archives, which I mostly work with, I try to promote all archives, as Tim mentioned. McGill's history tends to be focused on Army and a little bit more on Air Force. The university does not have a strong Navy connection, so the material that I had at hand, other than the physical crests themselves, the 54 crests, were pretty much close to non-existent. Well, I was fortunate that other archives, such as the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, Nova Scotia Public Archives, and Canadian War Museum, had a lot of paper material, but I could not get at because of the COVID, but they were very cooperative sending me digital images. What I was able to do was also lean very heavily on the work of Jay White, Dr. Jay White in Halifax, who had done extensive work in the 1980s on the history of the club. And that saved me having become too much involved in Halifax history. So I always give my thanks to him. So I was able to piece things together in the pandemic, starting with only the physical crests, that even the archives did not know the provenance. And I found that as a rabbit hole and some other major research I was doing. And so I pursued it, and the rabbit hole just kept getting larger and larger. But that's how it kind of evolved, having the material, but not hardly any documentation.
All right, thanks very much, Wes. All right, any last questions at all before we break for lunch? Going once, going twice? All right, I don't see any others. So again, thank you to all of our presenters for this, our last session. And for those of you joining us here in Sydney, you can all enjoy the lunch that's here. And thanks especially to Wes and to Anne-Marie for Zooming us in today on Saturday morning. So thanks, everybody. So with great delight, and again, speaking here from Unama'ki, the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq, I'm very interested and excited to hear our next keynote, indeed the keynote that will close out our conference, importantly. And I'm very happy to welcome and to introduce Dr. Donald Julian to our conference today. Dr. Julian is a Mi'kmaq historian, a human rights advocate, and a leader in his community. With over 51 years of experience researching and documenting Mi'kmaq history, his lifelong advocacy has also helped to preserve important archaeological sites in Nova Scotia. No matter the topic, he brings a well-grounded, informed, and unique Mi'kmaq experience to current issues. Dr. Julian has 34 years of experience with the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq and has held the position of Executive Director of the Confederacy of the Mainland Mi'kmaq since 1994. He is a member of both the Order of Canada and the Order of Nova Scotia. He has earned the United Nations Peacekeeping Medal, Cyprus, the Canadian Peacekeeping Service Medal, the Queen's Golden Jubilee, and the Queen's Diamond Jubilee medals. A peacetime veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, Dr. Julian has served with the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada in both the 2nd Battalion in Calgary and with the 1st Battalion in Esquimalt, and has served in the United Nations Peacekeeping Tour in Cyprus. He has also served in Norway with the Canadian Ace Mobile Force in 1968, with the 1st Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, and Donald is presently serving on the Community Liaison Advisory Committee for Maritime Command for the Admiral of Canadian Navy, and has been appointed as an advisory member of the Chief of Defense Staff for the Canadian Armed Forces in 2020. He has been an advisor to the Commissioners of the RCMP and the advisor to the Auditor General of Canada on First Nations issues. Now in 2012, Dr. Julian donned again the Canadian Army uniform, becoming the 3rd honorary Lieutenant Colonel of 3 Intelligence Company at the very same location where he had signed on 45 years earlier. In 2016, he was appointed full colonel to the 5th CDTC, Gagetown, New Brunswick, for another 3-year term as the 1st honorary colonel to a Canadian Army Training Center in Canada. In December 2020, he has also been recently appointed for an additional 3-year term with the 5th Canadian Division Training Center at CFB Gagetown in New Brunswick as their honorary colonel. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Donald Julian.
Quite a bio, eh? I was wondering who the hell is he talking about? Kwe. Jilasuk tigum said nogama. Walali begisin walali o bibanimio utachigu and giskuk. Kanugi duado no kitchka down giskano damasi. I realized that unless you're Mi'kmaq or speak the language, you didn't know what I said. Kwe is easy, it's hello. Bijilasuk tigum said nogama means welcome, all my family, friends, and relatives. We're here at Unamagi. This is Cape Breton Island. That's one of our 7 Mi'kmaq districts. The Mi'kmaq has 7 districts, which the Grand Council of the Mi'kmaq governed. I'm also a member of the Mi'kmaq Grand Council. I'm a captain in the Grand Council. I was appointed 10 years ago. It's a lifetime appointment. My grandfather was a prayer leader in the Grand Council, and he was also chief in the Little Reserve, just down the road a little ways, in Kings Road. 2.5 acres and 2 perch. That's how the size of the reserve was. He was chief in 1916. And in 1917, the Department of Indian Affairs requested him to think about becoming a police officer under the Indian Act. And of course, at that time, the chiefs weren't being paid anything. So, I mean, that was a paid gig to pick up Mi'kmaq prisoners and escort them anywhere in the province. So he was provincially appointed as a constable and also under the Indian Act. Now, my topic was military, Mi'kmaq in the military. I have to start way back in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Mi'kmaq were involved in the wars between the French and the English for the supremacy of Mi'kma'ki, what I call Mi'kma'ki, which is now the Atlantic provinces. We were with the French. We were baptized under the Roman Catholic Church. And because of us baptized under the Roman Catholic Church, a lot of the missionaries basically dictated to us, to the chiefs at the time, who to fight, who to go to war with, or who to fight against. And of course, the missionary priests told our chiefs at the time, anybody that's not Roman Catholic, don't believe in God. And it's okay that if you murder him or kill him, it's all right. You're doing it in the name of God. So a lot of our people became Roman Catholics. 1610, Grand Chief member too, and 25 members of his family became Roman Catholic. And then several years later, the rest of our tribes became Roman Catholic. Today, I think about 90% of our people, we lost sort of 10% that have gone to other religions. But the military history, we were called Samogonists, and we're still called Samogonists. Now, it's kind of ironic because when you go to Alberta in the Blackfoot Nation, and I've been there several times, I asked one of their elders, what do you call a person in uniform? And they're Cree, well, they're Blackfoot. And he says, Samogonists. I said, wow. I said, that's exactly what we call a person in uniform, Samogonists. So our earlier warriors in the time, we called them Samogonists. So they fought with the French against the British. We fought for about 75 years in colonial Nova Scotia at the insistence of the French. Then the English came to our chiefs and told them, we don't want to fight against you anymore. So let's enter into peace and friendship treaties. So the first peace and friendship treaty that was signed was in 1725. Of course, that was in New England, the Costco Peninsula. Ratification of those treaties was 1726 and 28 by the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet chiefs. From that point on, we had different intermittent fightings between the French, the English, and the Mi'kmaq, along with the Maliseet. The Maliseet were on the Mi'kmaq side. Then we developed a larger group called the Wabanaki Confederacy, which was the Passamaquoddy, the Penobscot, the Abenaki, the Maliseet, and the Mi'kmaq. And we all joined together and we fought against probably your ancestors. Unless you're French, then we probably didn't fight against you. But in 1713, under the Treaty of Utrecht, France ceded over all of colonial Nova Scotia except for Ile Saint Jean and Ile Royale and the northern parts of New Brunswick. So from that point on, it was relatively calm. Every now and then there'd be a little bit uprising here and there. We signed treaties until, well, the first treaty we signed after 1725 was the 1752 in Halifax. Jean-Baptiste Cope was sent by our chiefs to see what's going on, because Jean-Baptiste Cope said on September 14th, 1752, he says, look, before you take any more of our Mi'kmaq lands, compensate us for what you're taking. Set aside Indian reserve lands so we can enjoy our hunting and fishing and trapping. Because there's settlers coming in, and settlers are pushing us aside because they're getting land grants from the British and from the colonial government of Nova Scotia. So we had to make sure that there was Indian reserve land set aside. And during those periods, large tracts of lands were set aside. And the biggest one was 11,520 acres, the whole area of Sheet Harbor. That was set aside for the Mi'kmaq people. Of course, it was held at the pleasure of the crown, the colonial crown. So as lands were being sought after, the colonial government did grant lands over top of where they promised First Nations people to live. The last treaty that the Mi'kmaq signed was in 1779. But there was a little bit of hiccup. During the American Revolutionary period, a couple of our younger chiefs from the Maliseet and the Mi'kmaq signed a treaty with Washington, General George Washington. It's called the Watertown Treaty. And they promised to provide 500 fighting men against the British. Quick thinking of Michael Franklin, who was a member of the Legislative Assembly of Nova Scotia, went to talk to the older chiefs. He sat down with chiefs in Windsor, Nova Scotia, in New Minas, and he told them, look, you guys have treaties. You've signed the burying of the hatchet in 1761 in Halifax, so you're not supposed to take up arms against us anymore. We're supposed to be peace and friendly with one another. So the older chief says, well, we don't want to follow the younger chief's rules, so we're going to sign a treaty. So in 1779, they signed in Windsor, then Rijibocto, then Fort Cumberland. So everything that under the American Revolutionary period and the promises made to Washington were null and void. There was no further action from the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet with that. Of course, I'm going to jump back a little bit. We buried the hatchet with Lieutenant Governor Jonathan Belcher on June 25th, 1761 in Halifax at the governor's farm. The governor said, the laws will be like great hedges about your rights. And as they began with a ceremonial burying of the hatchet, then once they did bury the hatchet, one chief spoke up. What happens if you war against us? Can we lift the hatchet back up? He was assured by his other chiefs, yes. If anything goes wrong, of course, we're not going to stand still. But from 1761 to 1779 and afterwards, there hasn't been any type of military action by the Mi'kmaq. And the reason why I'm going back to those is that we promised under those treaties to protect His Majesty, his heirs, and his heirs' heirs forever. And we were to protect His Majesty from any harm, domestic or foreign. The reason why I'm talking about that portion of it is that a lot of our men and women during the First, the Second, and the Korean conflict, that's what their thoughts were. If we join the Canadian forces, we're protecting the king and his heirs forever. The sad thing about that is that the Department of Indian Affairs during the First World War were contemplating prohibiting status Indians from entering into the war. And the reason why, there's several reasons why that they wanted to do that. One of them is that in 1867 we became wards of the federal government under Section 9124 of the British North American Act. So we were protected under the Dominion Government of Canada as wards of the country. So naturally, a ward, you don't expect him to go to war. So they made an order in council in 1914 to prohibit status Indians under the meaning of the Indian Act to not to fight. What they didn't do, what Duncan Campbell Scott didn't do, is let our people know, hey, you don't have to go and fight. There was 4,000 Aboriginal people that fought from 1917 to 1918. No, 1914 to 1918, sorry about that. And we lost 300. Here in Nova Scotia, we had 93 men volunteer. We lost 10. 9 overseas and 1 at home. The one at home was in basic training in Aldershot, and he died of diphtheria. So he's the only one that we know of that's Mi'kmaq that's buried here at home. He had full military honors in Bear River. Duncan Campbell Scott wanted to talk to some of the First Nations that were involved in the First World War and telling them, you don't have to be here. Nobody left. Guys kept fighting. They stayed with their regiments. They befriended a lot of people. Some of the things that our people should have understood but didn't is the Indian Act of 1876. There was a lot of different sections under that act Duncan Campbell Scott could have used to enfranchise my people. What I mean by enfranchisement is that you'd lose your Indian status if you didn't follow the sections of the Indian Act. One of them, Section 111 of the 1876 Indian Act, if you became a professional, which a soldier is a professional, you'd lose your status. If you got a grade 12 education, you'd lose your status. You would be no longer allowed on an Indian reserve. Don't know why Duncan Campbell Scott didn't push it, because the government of Canada, even though we were wards of the federal government, their whole intentions was to make us into good little brown white people. I hope I don't offend anybody for saying that. But they were trying to teach us animal husbandry, farming. We weren't used to farming. A lot of people, there's some people that took up farming, but most of our people did is hunt, fish, trap, fowl, gather, and produce products. That was our way of life. And in my language, a way of life is called nedugulimk. It's hard to say, but it means your way of life. Hunting, fishing, gathering, trapping, and so on. So in the expeditionary force, 90 guys went over. 80 came back. But in Canada, we were only a mere fraction. 4,000 is only a mere fraction of the 660,000 volunteers that went overseas. So on August 4th, 1914, when Britain declared war, the Dominion government of Canada was also at war. First World War, the Great War, as everybody knows what it was called, would force nations and empires to mobilize their units or their resources. Canada, we were only 8 million in Canada, but I think we showed what the Canadians were all about. And even the Aboriginal people of Canada that volunteered 4,000, I don't think we retarded the whole thing at all. Matter of fact, we added to the offensive. But you know, it's sad that people didn't realize that you could lose your status for joining the forces. The other crazy thing under the Indian Act was you had to seek permission from the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, Duncan Campbell Scott, before you left your country. Without permission, once again, you lost your Indian status. They didn't push that for some reason. So the contemplation in headquarters continued on until 1917. Because you know, in 1917, I don't have to tell you guys any of this history, you should all know it. 1917, the volunteerism in Canada was slowing down. And what government of Canada did is, and please excuse me, my mind's all over the place. They had an inscription in Canada. I know Quebec was very upset about it. So was a lot of other people upset that there was an inscription in Canada to force people into the Canadian forces. There is so much I give lectures for 6 hours at a time, so this 40 minutes It should be easy for me. But you know, there's so much to cover, and there's so little time to be able to do that. My biggest thing is that I would like to be able to put together a list of all people that were in the Canadian Forces, even from the Korean conflict onwards. I spent a little time. Matter of fact, you see, I'm still in uniform today. I was asked to be honorary lieutenant colonel for intelligence by our first African Nova Scotian lieutenant governor, my Aunt Frances. I said, Your Honor, why would you pick me? She said, we don't have a First Nations honorary. I said, well, I suppose that's a good reason, good enough reason. But they said, I don't know if I'll fit what you want me to do. And basically, I guess when you're an honorary, you're an ambassador of your regiment or your company, and I was with intelligence for 3 years. Now I'm with 5th Canadian Training Center out of Gagetown. It was my honor when I was asked by Brigadier General El Daoud, Nicholas El Daoud. Intelligence after 3 years said, well, you know, I don't know if you fit. I said, no, I don't know if I fit either, because you and I, my commanding officer, you and I are like loggerheads. And the only reason why we were at loggerheads, I sit on too many committees. I sit on the Admiral's Advisory Committee for the last 17 years. So when the Admiral asked me to come in uniform, and the intelligence uniform was what I was wearing on board ship, of course I'm going to listen to the guy that's above me. My CO was a major. He was down a little bit, even though he's my CO. So I told him, I said, well, you're going to have to talk to my CO. He doesn't want me to appear anywhere. And he says, why is that? I said, I'm an intelligence officer. I'm supposed to be hidden, out of sight. I'm supposed to sneak around. Admiral laughed. He said, the Cold War's been over for a while, son. He said, I don't know who the hell you're hiding from. But he said, I'll talk to him. So I was on board several ships being filmed, which I don't know if it was kosher or not, but I mean, he asked me to come on board, and I did. But it was interesting to be with them. But the thing is, you know, when you're sitting on other advisory committees, I would sit on the commissioners' side, RCMP Commissioners Advisory Committee. So when they ask you to do something, you almost have to, you're sort of obliged to try to follow. But anyway, so much for that. I want to tell you a couple of stories of a couple of our guys. And gentlemen, I was having lunch with this today. It's kind of funny. We started talking about Stephen Toney. Private Stephen Toney, he was with the 85th Battalion. He started with the 193rd, but once he got overseas, he was transferred. Now, during the First World War, and I know that most of you know that once you're getting to a war-type conditions, once you go in with a certain battalion, if they need you somewhere else, you're being transferred. Well, Stephen was transferred to the 85th. So on March 12th, 1917, Private Stephen Toney was transferred to France. It's an incredible story, because he had really fantastic sniper abilities. And he happened to be on the 85th in the front line. Just after he was transferred, according to several newspapers in Nova Scotia, the North Sydney Herald on November 18, 1918, the Halifax Herald of November 6, 1918, the Pictou Advocate of November 1, 1918, ran a story of Private Stephen Toney, a champion sniper that created a furor of curiosity in England. And to the readers here in Nova Scotia, they learned that Private Stephen Toney was also curiosity in England. After he did his sniper skills, he was gassed, and he affected his eyes. So as a sniper, you need your eyes. So they transferred him to England to get better. Well, the story goes, frontline general requested someone that with excellent sniper skills to come forward to take out German snipers that were killing Canadian soldiers in the trenches. Who comes forward but Stephen Toney? He was stationed some distance down the front line. There was a tree line about 1,000 yards away. The general focused his field glasses and told Tony, "I can't see the sniper." Stephen Toney spoke up to the general, "Suppose you watch." Private Toney carefully pulled the trigger. There at 1,000 yards away, dropped a German sniper. Then again, he pulled it several times, he pulled the trigger. He downed 6 more snipers. The story went that the general recommended him for the Victoria Cross because he saved the lives of all these guys in the trenches. Well, because of him being gassed and his eyesight affected, he did come back to the 85th, but couldn't see very well. So they put him on furlough and sent him home. What happened, it's never happened here in Nova Scotia or probably anywhere else. Well, I can't speak for anywhere else. The mayor and council of New Glasgow held a civic reception for Stephen Toney. First time ever a mayor and council were going to give a Mi'kmaq an honor roll. It was not only Stephen, Teddy also, and also another gentleman also received the scroll. But you know, I've been looking up and down everywhere, newspapers and stuff. I was hoping to find some indication of what the general may have sent with respect to even the military merit medal or even the DCM. A Victoria Cross, that would be too much to ask for. But Stephen Toney didn't receive any one of those. He got the Scroll of Honor from New Glasgow, and that's all he received, which was, I think he was very happy about it. The gentleman and myself were talking about the rifle. Usually a rifle from a sniper is usually returned to him. I have rumors to believe I know where it is, but I've got to hold that close to my chest until I prove that it is the rifle. But it's in Nova Scotia somewhere, and I'm sorry I can't tell you where it is. But my second story is about a guide from down in Milton, down around Queens County. His name was Sam Glode. Him and 3 of his brothers joined the Canadian Forces during the First World War. Sam and one of his other brothers joined in New Brunswick, and 2 other younger brothers joined in Nova Scotia. Sam was with the 47th Canadian Expeditionary Force. And he was transferred later to the 6th Battalion Canadian Engineers. A little bit of story about Sam. He got overseas, and I guess he must have, he did befriend a Cape Breton miner. There's a story in the Gazette, the Cape Breton Gazette, in 1944. They were being summoned out. The miners were leaving for France. So his friend popped his head into the tent and told Sam, he said, "Why don't you come with us?" Sam said, "I can't, I'm not a miner. I don't know the first thing about mining." He said, "They don't know that." come on out anyway. Just come amongst us. So Sam did. And sure enough, he was transferred to the 6th Battalion of the Canadian Engineers, No. 1 Tunneling Company. He began his training there. According to the stories of Sam, what his main mission was to build tunnels to the German lines, build a bunch of explosives, and blow it up. And I think the Germans were doing the same things to us. One point in time, the tunnel caved in. And they didn't know where they were, how far they were out, but they were in no man's land. So Sam tunneled up. And it happened that it was night. They tunneled up, and he says, well, I think we're in no man's land. We just have to stay put. Now, they heard somebody tunneling towards them, but they couldn't determine which way this tunneling was coming from, either from the Germans or from our side. Thank God it was our side that came in and saved them. But he earned his Distinguished Conduct Medal as occupation duties after the war. Sam defused 450 landmines. He told his men, he was a corporal by then, he told his men, I'll do it. I don't want you guys to get hurt. The war is over with. So he defused 450 landmines. And his distinguished kind of citation read, Corporal Sam Glode showed great devotion to duty and utter disregard of personal danger. And he was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, which we're very proud of Sam. I've spoken to his family a number of times. I'm attempting to do a book on my First World War veterans. Not mine, but the tribal people. And I want to honor the 93 men and also the people, the guys that died over there. And in my book, I'm also going to be honoring the First World War veterans of the Mi'kmaq in New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and also the Gaspé Peninsula. Because altogether, when you put all our guys, we were about 150 strong that served in the First World War. Thank goodness you can get the files on those people now because they're all digitized and you just got to know their names. And there was a gentleman out of British Columbia, and I hope I don't screw up his name, and I probably will, Shingling Loft. Jeffrey Shingling Loft did research on First Nations in all wars from 1992 to 93. He has an extensive list of our people. I went to Ottawa several times and looked through the dusty boxes. I mean, they're dusty. They're a little over 100 years old now. Of our people, all our people. 660,000 files. Unless you know where to look. I just like looking at a needle in a haystack. But thank God for this guy from British Columbia. He had a list of First World War, Second World War, and also the Korean conflict. So it made it a little bit easier for me to find their files. And now that they're digitized, you just have to know the name, and you can get the whole file. So I've got my 93 soldiers. I've got their files, and what I've told people in Nova Scotia that are related to these people, you can have the files. Those are yours. I'm just protecting them right now. Now, as a researcher, you have to be very careful in some of the files because some of the medical records you have to sort of bite your tongue and wonder if they should have it or not. Sometimes it's very touchy, to say the least. But you know, we had 619,636 men and women that served our Canadian Expeditionary Force. We had 66,655 gave their ultimate sacrifice, their lives. And 172,960 were wounded. And at this time, I want to thank you. I want to go on and on and on and on, but matter of fact, I'm going to give you one more story, and it's about the Second World War. During the Second World War, it was 126 Mi'kmaq that volunteered, and we lost 5. One of the guys that we lost was assassinated. He was assassinated under the orders of Colonel Kurt Myers of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Myers told these men the day after D-Day, we will take prisoners, but we will not allow them to live. We will execute them. 18 of our Canadian soldiers were executed. 11 the first night. 1 out of the 11 was a Mi'kmaq. He was with the North Nova Scotia Highland Regiment. They were buried in a shallow grave in Abbey Ardennes Gardens. His name was Private Charles Doucette of Membertou. 11 were executed, buried in shallow graves. The next day, the remainder were executed, buried in shallow graves. A year or so later, a little boy was playing in the Abbey Gardens, and he unearthed a jawbone. Of course, he told his mom, and his mom told the authorities. And the Canadian forces went to examine, and they found 18 of our soldiers buried in shallow graves on top of one another. I gave that presentation on the D-Day celebration, and he's got one daughter left, still living here in Membertou. And I thanked her for her father's sacrifice. And she mentioned that she didn't remember, but she was only a baby when he left for war. I'd like to have known the names of the other 17 men. More than likely they were with the Cape Breton Highlanders or with the Highland regiments. But their lieutenant told them that we're surrounded by the Panzer Division. Our only safety is to wave a flag, and we'll probably be in concentration camps for the rest of the war. Little did they know that Kurt Myers gave orders to execute. And those poor men died to protect our peace, all of us, for all of us. Also, during the Korean conflict, we had 25 guys that signed up. We lost 2. Now, the guys in the First World War, if they were young enough, served in the Second World War. Gentlemen in the Second World War, if there were majority of them, I wouldn't say all of them, but a number of them joined into the Korean conflict. Mi'kmaq have been joining the Canadian forces after the Korean conflict. To how many, I'm not sure. But I think a lot of us, like myself, I was in uniform as a youth from 17 to 22. Still in uniform as an old man. I'm 72 now, so I mean, I'm still serving our country as an honorary, and it's a very distinct pleasure for me to serve. And the reason why I'm there, I'm trying to promote the idea to my youth is to sign up, either into the militia or into the regular force. We have several Aboriginal programs, one with the Navy, it's called Aboriginal Evaluation Program. It's a 3-week course. And if you want to get in, that's the fastest way in. And then we have a youth one in Gagetown. This is our 7th year. From 16 to 30. I guess anybody that's 30 and under, or you're still a youth. But we train and we give basic military qualifications to these youth so they can join the militia units within their respective towns. And I think there's a number, and I'm not sure what the number is, but there's a number in the Cape Breton Highlanders. Because at the training center, we do have at least 3 guys that are a part of the Black Bear program that are from the Cape Breton Highlanders that do part of that training. So, you know, they've moved on. So, I mean, it's a good avenue. I wish they had it when I was a young feller. My background is Sea Cadets. Can you imagine? I spent several years as Sea Cadets. I made as Chief Petty Officer. So when I signed up, I wanted to go to the Navy. Was in Windsor Park. Met 11 other guys. And I was the only Navy person. Going Cornwallis. To give you a little story, don't laugh at me. I'm the only child, right? I don't have no brothers and sisters. So in order for me to get into the Canadian Forces, I had to agree to my mom, the boss, that I'm going to join the Navy and go down to Cornwallis and hopefully be in the seaport of Halifax. Little did I know there was a couple of other ports. There was Ile St. Jean and also one in BC. Could have been in BC. I mean, I was in BC anyway. But the guys talked me out of the Navy into the Army. So I had to come home. I went home to my mom and I told her, I remustered. And of course, a civilian doesn't know what the hell remustered is. She said, what do you mean by remustered? Did you add a little bit more mustard on your hot dog or something? I said, no, Mom. I changed from the Navy to the Army. So she said, oh, you're going to Gagetown. I said, no, I'm not joining the Black Watch. She said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada in Calgary, Alberta. She hummed and hawed, and first thing she did is call my cousins, just 2 cousins that were in Lethbridge. She said, can you tell me how far Lethbridge is from Calgary? I said, it's about 2 hours. I said, why? She said, well, Dorothy and Lena are there teaching on the reserve. I just want to make sure that when you're in basic training, if you get sick, get hurt, or whatever happens to you, you have family nearby. So they came to visit me a couple of times while I was in basic training to report back to my mother. But if you're an only child, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So, you know, but it's been interesting, and I've never regretted the time I was in with the Queen's Own, the 1st, the 2nd, and then the 1st Battalion. We did 6 months tour of duty in '67. I turned 18 by 4 days. April 4th is my birthday. April 8th, we were going overseas to Cyprus. I can sort of understand a little about how the guys must have felt going overseas at 18 years old. I wasn't going to any war. It was just peacetime. United Nations peacekeeping. I don't know if any of you has ever gone to Cyprus, but it's hot as hell in the summer. At least 110 in the shade. Beautiful country. It's too bad that the people were warring against one another, the Greeks and the Turks. But if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy. We could, only a few minutes before we go to watch the color presentation. I'd be more than happy to answer anything you may have. Thought you were going to take this one. That's okay. I went through a lot of stuff fast, so I'm sorry about that.
Thank you very much for that talk. I enjoyed it very much. Hi, Tim Cook. I'm from
Hi, Tim.
I'm from Ottawa.
Yeah, I met you before.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I wonder if maybe you could speak a bit to, you talked about those who served in the First World War, the Second War, Korea. Do you have any thoughts about what happened when they came back home? Now they're veterans. Were they seen differently by their friends and family? Did they think that they were seen differently by the state or the Indian agents? Or
Well, Tim, I think the worst thing that ever happened to First Nations veterans was that the Veterans Affairs gave the responsibility of veterans to Department of Indian Affairs. Indian Affairs didn't take good care of us in the beginning, and they added on another responsibility of veterans. So we weren't seen and we weren't taken care of as well as our brothers and sisters that weren't Native, because you could get so many acres of land as a veteran under the veterans' land. But First Nations people, all you received was part of your reserve land, and you'd never own it. All you get is a certificate of possession, so you could pass it on to your family. They did get some remuneration. People were very proud of them. I've talked to several family members, especially guys came back from the Second World War, and the ones that came home wounded. And talking to, I shouldn't say kids, they're about my age now, and they said probably the best thing that happened to them at that time, that their father continued getting the veterans allowance because of his wounds, and it helped his big family. So, I think the Veterans Affairs after the Second World War did start to provide a lot more for the First Nation soldiers. And a lot of guys were held in higher esteem by their own people for serving, even though we didn't have to. One thing that people don't realize, that we weren't citizens of our own country until May of 1956. We weren't given the right to vote till after the women of Canada had the right to vote in 1960. Immigration Act changed in May of 1956 to allow the Indians of Canada to become citizens of their own country. And they did retroactive back to 1947, when the Human Rights Declaration was recognized. So our guys risked an awful lot. If Indian Affairs would have pushed, they would have been enfranchised and they would have lost their Indian status. So we're very proud of our soldiers. And we didn't have ladies take part in this until the Second World War. We had at least 2, possibly 3 ladies that joined, and I think they were nurses. They were trained. When you're looking at figures and stuff, it wasn't until 1943 before we were allowed to go into the Royal Canadian Navy or the Royal Canadian Air Force. But we were allowed into the Army. So Tim, yes, we think the world of them, and we continue thinking the world of them. A lot of our communities have cenotaphs in their communities now. We celebrate our Remembrance Day in our communities. A lot of our guys have joined the American Armed Forces. I have 7 that were in the Marine Corps out of my reserve. The first one was in the 1950s, was a cousin of mine, Ben Martin. He was with the Marine Corps and he was military police. Matter of fact, he had the responsibility of guarding Einstein. So, there's a number, there's 7 from and there's at least 5 or 6 from almost every community that has been in the Marine Corps. We have a number of people that fought in Vietnam. We lost one over there, Vincent Bernard from Wakimatukuk. He received the Purple Heart. And a few years ago, his sister showed me the Purple Heart and the citation he received. So there is a number of our people that served in both countries. The Jay Treaty allowed us to be able to work on either side. So, so it's one of my own cousins from my community joined the Marine Corps, and his mother asked me, he said, I've been asked, how come he's going over? I said, the Jay Treaty allowed us. We have dual citizenship. And it doesn't matter if you serve for one country over another. This is North America. And we're North American Indians. So, Tim, I don't know if I answered your question, my friend. Yeah, thank you. I go on and on and on and on.
We can take some more questions. Yes, Ken.
I'd just like to make a comment. Ken Donovan, I've known Don for a long time when he was coming to visit Lewisburg. But I just wanted to, with Sandy Balcom, I just wanted to thank you, Don, for your presentation.
Thank you. How's Sandy?
He's doing good. He's down in Hines right now, looking after his house down in Hines, but he lives in Sydney.
Okay, I know that somebody told me that he was in well there for a little while.
A little while, but he's fine now.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to me. And we've got 15 minutes to watch the changing of the colors or receiving of new colors. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Just as we, close the conference here, I just wanted to say thank you to a few people. First, I wanted to thank our conference co-organizers, of course, Ian McIntyre, Brian Ferguson of the Atlantic Memorial Park. I also want to thank CBU for supporting the conference as much as it has. And of course, one more kind of round of applause maybe to all of our presenters for the wonderful papers that they've given. All right, and of course now you're all welcome to join us at the soccer field for the Cape Breton Highlanders presentation of colors. Thanks, everyone.